Chapter 1080. Felix was so scared that his face turned pale. He hurriedly persuaded, "Stop! I order you to stop attacking." The two mechas stopped in place, seeming to be in a dilemma. Dean whispered to Felix, "Tell one of them to come down and negotiate with me." Felix immediately knew what Dean was thinking. He was extremely anxious, but he could only bite the bullet and say, "He wants one of you to come down and talk to him. The one in the ghost shift mecha, you come down." The mecha on the left was like a Buddha, but its whole body was made of black metal. There were several giant claws on its body, and it was very ferocious. Its back was high, and there seemed to be whiskers fluttering on it. It was like a ghost. Hearing Felix's order, the face of the pilot sitting inside changed slightly, but he didn't act immediately. After a moment of silence, he suddenly used the communicator to quickly say a few words to the pilot on the right. Dean saw this scene with his X-ray vision and knew that it was not good. Sure enough, the strange Buddha-like ghost shift mecha on the left slowly walked over. It didn't seem to have any malice, but a vertical pupil suddenly split open on its forehead, and a laser shot out from it. The laser was very thick, enough to completely envelop Dean. The moment Dean saw the vertical pupil split open, he suddenly pulled back. Bang! The laser penetrated the ground in front of him. Felix was stunned, and then he jumped in anger. "What are you doing?" The two mechas didn't respond. They quickly rushed over and flanked Dean. Dean's face darkened. He guessed what the two mecha were thinking. Things suddenly became a bit tricky. He took a deep breath and threw Felix to a big tree behind him. His whole body was covered in raging flames, and the sharp blades on his body were as red as soldering iron. The black splitter turned into a bright red burning splitter. The magic mark ability of the Sun Beast was integrated into the splitter, and the surging power made him feel as if he could destroy the world with a wave of his hand. However, his heartbeat also beat violently at this moment, making him feel a tearing pain. "Finish this quickly." Dean's eyes were terrifyingly cold. The burning wings suddenly flapped, and he fell into the night sky like a fireball. The ghost shift mecha's forehead immediately shot out a laser beam. The interval was extremely short, not even half a second. Dean's body swayed up and down, dodging the laser shot. Although the speed of the laser was extremely fast, making it difficult for him to react, he saw the hidden laser charging device behind the vertical pupil through his X-ray vision. Whenever the charging was about to be completed, he quickly adjusted the direction so that the mecha had no time to change direction. In less than 2 seconds, Dean was in front of the ghost transformation mech. Facing him were 4 strange arms. These arms grew from the armpits of the Buddha. The arms were covered with extremely long hair, and the nails were sharp like claws. The skin was blue, and the hands were holding a hammer, knife, sword, and shield. At this moment, the hammer and knife were swung down, the shield was in front of him, and the sword was raised from below. "Break!" Dean roared. He felt his heart contract fiercely, and the pain came. He didn't care about reducing his strength. The flames on the sharp blades scattered out, turning into fire shadows that obscured the mecha's sight. At the same time, he dodged the giant hammer and rushed to the side of the giant knife. The tail blade swung, and with a bang, the knife was cut off. Dean crossed the knife and rushed to the shield inside. The sharp blades suddenly gathered and turned into a cone-shaped spiral blade in front of him. With a bang, the giant shield was drilled a hole. Dean's wings flapped rapidly, and he pushed his body again, like a burning firebird, breaking into the chest of the mecha. Plop! The mecha crashed to the ground. Dean drilled out from behind the mecha. Before he had time to breathe, he felt a tingling sense of danger. He hurriedly dodged. He didn't look back, but he had seen clearly that it was a laser shot from the eyes of another mecha that looked like a 9-tailed fox. This laser attack was extremely powerful, and it seemed that every mecha was equipped with it. At this moment, the 9-tailed fox mecha quickly rushed toward Dean, its 9 tails flashing, shooting out a large number of silver metal needles. Dean petrified the sharp blade and let the silver needles stab him. He was unharmed, and he didn't even feel pain. He had shot the nine-tailed fox's chest with the heat ray. At this moment, the hair on its chest was still broken, revealing the metal armor inside. Dean's eyes were gloomy, and the vertical pupil on his forehead split again. While dodging the silver needles, he suddenly took the time to shoot a light beam. Bang! The light beam hit the metal plate on his chest while the nine-tailed fox was moving. It looked like the nine-tailed fox had hit the metal plate on its own. Dean found that although this semi-biological mecha was strong, its combat experience was obviously not comparable to the abyss inside the giant wall. Perhaps it could match the Abyss Lord in all aspects of performance data, but in the face of the real Abyss Lord, the difference in combat experience would make the battle one-sided. He didn't choose to fight head-on, lest his heart couldn't bear it. He felt as if his heart was broken. The main reason was that he had to deal with one of them as soon as possible. Whoosh! He petrified and dodged the nine-tailed fox's attack. From time to time, he found its flaws and shot a heat ray. The heat ray hit the metal plate on the nine-tailed fox's chest every time. If you looked closely, you would find that it hit the same place every time. The nine-tailed fox mecha seemed to be aware of Dean's intention, and its attacks became more and more impatient. Suddenly, it roared to the sky and the harsh sound waves came. Dean felt a burst of dizziness in his mind. He had a dreamy feeling like he was drunk. At this moment, a feeling of horror suddenly came. Dean woke up from the intoxicated feeling, only to feel a lot of cold sweat all over his body. A laser expanded in his sight. He instinctively dodged to the side, but was still shot by the laser. With a whoosh, he felt his body become a little lighter. He looked around and found that the sharp blades protruding from his right shoulder had disappeared along with a fist-sized piece of his right shoulder, revealing the flesh and bones inside. Is it a spiritual magic mark ability? Dean's face changed slightly. The cells in his body surged, and the broken blades were reassembled again, but the bones and flesh in his shoulder couldn't heal themselves in a short time. He turned into the appearance of Splitter, like a fierce beast covered with sharp blades, rushing toward the nine-tailed fox. The nine-tailed fox swung its nine tails. The tips of the nine tails were extremely sharp, and impressively, they were made of metal like 9 sharp blades. Dean suddenly sped up and escaped the attack of the nine-tailed fox, but the instantaneous acceleration exceeded the limit of his body. His heart felt like it was being torn again. He gritted his teeth and pounced on the chest of the nine-tailed fox. His tail blade smashed down and penetrated the metal plate. He saw a panicked woman in the cab. His eyes were full of tyranny, and several sharp blades shot madly from his body. Puff, puff, puff. The graceful woman's body was pierced with holes, and a lot of blood flowed out of the wounds. Her beautiful face was blurred by the blood, and she looked like a devil. Then flames leaped out of the wounds in her body, burning her body. Dean opened his mouth and inhaled. The flames attached to the cab were sucked into his mouth like air and disappeared. Dean removed the magic body and looked down at the beating heart in his chest. He saw that the heart, which was the size of a baby's fist, had expanded by half, and the color of the heart had become dazzling, like pure gold. However, the shape was a bit strange, and there were 4 lumps of flesh that looked like tumors on it. The heart still can't bear the full strength of the body. Dean slightly gritted his teeth. The 4 lumps of flesh that grew out of the heart made him inexplicably uneasy. He always felt that the formed heart would slowly integrate with the body, and then completely become his heart, and grow to the point where it could bear the full strength of his current body. However, the sudden appearance of the 4 lumps of flesh made him feel a sense of horror. After a few breaths of rest, Dean jumped down from the mecha, went to the tree, and took down Felix, who was hanging on the treetop in a very sorry state. Felix had witnessed the 2 strongest 4-star mechas in the factory being defeated by Dean, and he was terrified. Now, he could see that his previous estimation of Dean was completely wrong. This was clearly the existence of the Lord of the Abyss, not some lower abyss. Chapter 1081. According to Felix's understanding of the demon society, the Lord of the Abyss was a big shot in the demon race, second only to the 7 kings who ruled the demon race. Why would such a person take the risk of sneaking into the Federation alone? He couldn't figure it out, but he knew that this demon had a big secret. Don't kill me. I've already cooperated with you to escape. If you want to leave, I'll help you erase your identity and the clues you left behind. I won't put you on the wanted list, I swear. Felix hurriedly shouted when Dean brought him to the front of the mecha. Didn't I say that the environment here is good? I don't want to leave for now. Dean indifferently said, There is a communicator in the mecha. Immediately contact the people in the factory and tell them that you are safe. 2 mechas have rescued you. Ask them to send a chariot to pick you up. Felix's face changed. You're going back? Why else would I come out? You. Felix's face was pale. If Dean went back, he would be under the control of the demons all the time. He suddenly realized that Dean planned to sneak into the base again and take charge of this place from the dark. Is this the purpose of the demons? To sneak into the Federation and try to disintegrate us from the inside. Such a thought flashed in Felix's mind, but he didn't have time to think about it. Under Dean's gaze, he forced himself to convey Dean's words through the communicator in the mecha. The higher-ups on the other side of the communicator were all relieved and cheered when they heard that he was fine. Are you going back with me? Felix looked at Dean. He already had an answer in his heart. Even if you cover your face, they'll still ask you when they see you. How should I answer them? Dean said indifferently, There's no need to go through so much trouble. He came to the ghost shifter mecha and took off the jacket of the pilot inside. Then, he ignited a flame in his hand and burned the body. After that, he put on the pilot's jacket and sat in the cockpit. At the same time, he pulled Felix to the co-pilot's cabin next to the cockpit. The co-pilot's cabin didn't have a connecting device and was mainly used to rescue companions on the battlefield. It wasn't big and could only accommodate 5 people at most. You know how to operate a mecha? Felix couldn't help but be astonished when he saw Dean's posture. He remembered that when Dean came to the factory, he was directly shut down. No one trained him, so how could he control the mecha? Dean responded to him in the next second. He pressed the login device on the cockpit, and several tentacles around him suddenly danced, wrapped around Dean, and then connected with his skin, penetrating into his body. In an instant, a lot of information seemed to pour into Dean's mind. It was about this mech, or to be precise, about this monster. Abilities, habits, tastes, a lot of information emerged. After 4 or 5 seconds, Dean's eyes showed a clear color. He felt that his body had become infinitely huge. His perception was magnified several times, extending to the surrounding world. He could feel the outside wind caressing his body. He could feel the fragile earth under his feet. This feeling was simply comfortable. It was his first time connecting with a demonic mech, and he didn't expect it to feel so good. He couldn't help but control the mech to jump on the spot. Whoosh! The mech suddenly bounced up, flew up to 100 meters in the air, and then fell back down. The earth trembled, but Dean felt that his body was full of unparalleled explosive power. He felt that he could easily destroy a city right now. Felix, who was sitting next to the co-pilot, looked at the demon incredulously. Even for a professionally trained mecha pilot, it would take more than 3 minutes of resonance connection to be able to control the mecha. In the process of resonance connection, the pilot also needed to familiarize and memorize the information fed back by the mecha. This huge amount of information was enough to make the average person's brain hurt. But Dean completed the resonance connection in just a few seconds. How strong was his brain? We can go back now. Dean tilted his head and smiled. He was in a particularly good mood. The demonic mech not only gave him an extraordinary experience of power, but also made him very excited. If he was the one controlling the demonic mech, it should be very easy to kill the other lords of the abyss. On the way back, he tried to activate the magic marks of the splitter in his body. The power of the magic marks surged out of his body. In the next moment, he felt that the power seemed to flow out of his body and into a larger container. Then, he felt a dozen-meter-thick splitter blades growing out of the body of the mech. In addition to that, 2 huge blade wings protruded out of the back of the evil Buddha. The magic mark's ability can extend to the demonic body without any hindrance. Dean was shocked. He suddenly sprinted forward. With a whoosh, the scenery around him moved as fast as lightning. He crossed thousands of meters in the blink of an eye. This speed was 2 or 3 times faster than before. Felix, who was in the co-pilot's seat, looked at the scenery outside and was shocked. He felt that this mech seemed to have broken the limit of their design. Suddenly, he thought of something and hurriedly said, "Not good, your power is too strong. If you use the full power of the mech won't be able to bear it." Dean was startled. He suddenly felt that some of the joints outside the mech were slightly loose. It seemed that the mech was about to disintegrate. He quickly slowed down and put away the power of the magic mark. Most pilots use themselves as the energy to activate the power contained in the mech. Felix sat in the co-pilot's seat and smiled slightly. "But the energy in your body is too strong, even stronger than our mech. Not only can you fully stimulate the potential of the mech, but you can also overload it. It seems that if I have a mech that can bear my power, I should be invincible, right?" Dean's eyes slightly lit up. Felix's mouth slightly twitched. He was silent. It didn't take long for them to see several chariots coming over. "Even if you're wearing his clothes, they'll still recognize you." Felix shook his head. Dean raised his hand and pressed on his face, adjusting the bones. Soon, his face was 70 to 80% similar to the previous ghost shift pilot. In the darkness of the night, if one didn't look carefully, they wouldn't be able to recognize each other. Felix couldn't help but gasp when he saw this. Finally, he smiled bitterly and didn't say anything. "We're here to pick up the president, Lucifer." The chariot stopped, and a middle-aged man with a righteous face called out. He was the previous head of the factory's security. Felix glanced at him, the corner of his mouth slightly twitching. He let Dean bring up the external projection of the mech and said through the mech's loudspeaker, "No need. Lucifer will send me back. You can escort me from behind." Chapter 1082. President, that demon. The head of security asked cautiously. After all, he had to bear the main responsibility for Dean's escape. Felix glanced at Dean, indicating how to answer. Dean whispered a few words. Felix was startled for a moment, then a wry smile appeared on his face. He said to the head of security, "The demon has escaped, and Chioling is chasing after him. I don't know how the situation is. Let's go back first, lest the demon comes back." The head of security was startled. He didn't expect Dean to be able to escape from the encirclement of 2 4-star mechas. Seeing that there was no protection around, he hurriedly said, "President, please return to the factory quickly. I'll bring up the rear." Felix was amused by his words of loyalty. He sighed and turned off the external projection. He turned to Dean and whispered, "I've done everything you told me. What do you want to do? You want a legal identity in the Federation. I can get it for you, and you won't be tracked down. I hope you can leave. Otherwise, sooner or later, you'll be exposed, and I won't be able to protect you." Dean smiled and said, "They'll send someone to check the battle later. You can call a few of your trusted men to investigate. I'll stay here for a while." Felix's face turned ugly. Every day Dean didn't leave meant that his life wasn't under his control. It wasn't a good feeling. On the way, Dean told Felix a few more things. Before long, they returned to the underground factory. They saw that several high-level executives were waiting at the door to greet them. Seeing Felix come out of the mecha, they were relieved and hurriedly came forward to ask about his well-being. They were very concerned. Felix exchanged a few words and asked Dean to follow him. In order to express his gratitude for Dean's rescue, he promoted Dean's position to the position of mecha manager. The original mecha manager was the woman who piloted the nine-tailed fox. Now that she was dead, her position was vacant. It was a matter of course that it fell to Dean. No one objected. Dean and Felix returned to the lowest office and closed the door. Felix, who was leading the way, bowed slightly. Dean, who was following behind him, went straight to the chair in the office and sat down. He looked around and said to Felix, who was a little reserved in front of him, "You're the president of the Lock Consortium's Hosk Company in Copper Ship City. Tell me about the Lock Consortium and the Tesla Consortium. Also, give me a detailed map of the 100 cities of the Federation. Pay attention, don't play tricks." Felix looked at Dean, who was giving orders. He was a little indignant, but he obediently listened with a smile. In just one night, Dean learned a lot about the Federation from Felix. He had also designed a few small traps to test the authenticity of Felix's words. He had learned these things from Luke and the other two mecha pilots. He roughly believed most of what Felix said, but he still had some doubts. It would be great if I had the Dream Breeder's magic mark. Dean thought of Crimson Moon's ability and was a little envious. Unfortunately, the Dream Breeder was a 5-star legendary monster. Dean also asked about the various instruments in the factory. As he had learned before, many of the instruments here were of great help to him. After all, although there was no research on the undead here, Hosk made a semi-biological mecha and had a deep understanding of the monster's body. Therefore, the instruments here were top-notch biology-related research instruments, enough for him to understand his own situation. Dean waited for Felix to finish and asked him to vacate a separate factory. Then he selected some instruments and asked him to send someone to deliver them. It was already dawn. After a night of continuous fighting, Dean couldn't help but feel a little tired. Felix saw that Dean seemed to be in a good mood, so he asked in a low voice, "Mr. Dean, I really don't understand. You're so powerful. Why didn't you threaten me at the beginning? That way, you would have been spared from these sufferings." Sufferings? Dean smiled as he thought of some of the punishments. "At the beginning I came with the attitude of cooperating with you. Who knew that you would directly lock me up? I could only come up with this plan." Felix was startled. "Really? Of course it's fake." Dean smiled. Felix's mouth twitched slightly. He held back his anger and asked patiently, "If not, why didn't Mr. Dean make a move at the beginning? At first, I didn't know who was the leader here." Dean laughed and said, "You sent a manager to receive me into the cage, and then you appeared. I didn't know if you were the highest-ranking behind-the-scenes commander here, so I could only stay inside and figure out the situation. Who knew that you were more simple than I thought?" "That's the reason?" Felix heard Dean's sarcasm and felt a little aggrieved. His heart was filled with regret. Unfortunately, he couldn't go back in time. If I had violently broken the cage at the beginning, I would have been able to scare you. But your defense isn't weak. In case you contacted the military and sent people to encircle me, my situation would be even more dangerous." Dean slowly said, "On the contrary, if I stayed inside, I would have time to observe you. You think that I'm the one trapped, but in fact, it's you who are trapped." Felix's pupils shrank. He felt a trace of coldness. He finally knew how insidious and cunning the demon in front of him was. He was by no means a bloodthirsty and brainless demon like his previous impression. "So, you know how to operate our Protoss mecha. Did you interrogate Luke and the others?" Felix had already thought of Dean's means and asked while clenching his teeth. Dean nodded. Felix slightly clenched his fist. He couldn't wait to tear Luke and the others apart. When Luke and the others came out, He had sent people to ask them what had happened inside. But their words had no weight at all. They had been forced to confess by Dean. This was a naked betrayal. For the time being, there's no need to report the escape of the demons. You will suppress this matter. Dean said to Felix, I don't want the military to come to investigate us now and add to the trouble. Felix's heart sank. In addition, I know that you have a way to pass information to the outside world. But you know the consequences. It won't be good for you. You will be the first to die. Dean stared at him. Chapter 1083. President, your breakfast is ready. Not long after the two finished talking, a gentle and sweet voice came from outside the room. Felix frowned and said impatiently, I'm not in the mood to eat. Let's go. Dean looked at him meaningfully. After one night, the others should want to talk to you about something. For example, how to deal with the aftermath of the escape of the demon. Felix's face changed slightly, but he forced a smile. Yes, let's go together. Then he stopped the woman outside the door. Wait, I'll get dressed. Dean and Felix changed into a set of clothes and came to another restaurant built in midair. This restaurant was built in the suspension of the lowest floor of the factory. It was surrounded by glass pipes, so they could see the situation below. The dining table was very long, and there were exquisite vases. The tablecloths were sprayed with perfume. It showed what kind of taste Felix liked to pursue in life. After Dean and Felix took a seat, Felix ordered 2 steaks to be served. These steaks were usually made on the spot after he came. The chef who cooked the steaks was next to the restaurant. He was a star chef. Felix ate slowly. He felt that the steak, which was delicious in the past, was now chewing like wax. He ate absent-mindedly. Not long after, footsteps came from outside. The white-bearded old man and several other senior executives of the factory came in together. They saw Felix eating at the table and immediately greeted him. Then they saw Dean eating with them. There was a look of understanding in their eyes. They knew that Felix was grateful to Dean for saving him, so he invited him to eat together. The senior executives came forward and said a few polite words to Dean. Then they said a few words about Felix's health, and finally stated their purpose. President, I heard that the demon escaped. He should still be in our bronze ship city. Should we contact the military and search the city? The white-bearded old man asked politely. Felix's heart shivered. He unconsciously glanced at Dean, but he saw that Dean was smiling as if it had nothing to do with him. Felix narrowed his eyes and thought for a moment. Don't alarm the military, and don't report this to the consortium headquarters. Once the military is alarmed, they will investigate the details and origin of the demon, and we won't be able to get away with it. If we report this to the financial group's headquarters, they will blame us for our incompetence. Not only will I be criticized, but everyone here will also be punished. Everyone was slightly startled. When they heard him say the word punishment, they couldn't help but frown and feel uneasy. President, how should we deal with this demon? Are we just going to let him leave like that? Someone asked. Felix thought about it and said, We'll talk about it after some time. At that time, we'll just say that we accidentally found traces of the demons and report it to the military. This way, we'll be rewarded if we capture the demons. Everyone looked at each other and said to Felix, The president is wise. President, why don't we report to the military now that we've found traces of the demons? The more the demons stay in the city, the more danger the citizens will face. A middle-aged man in a white suit asked in confusion. Felix shook his head. He snuck in with a military identity, and he's also using a military appearance for the time being. He just left, so I don't think he'll change back to his real identity for the time being. Instead, he snuck into the city with a military identity and found a place to stay. If we report this to the military now, once we find him and see his appearance, our matter will be exposed. The middle-aged man in a white suit said in admiration, President is thoughtful. Felix smiled wryly in his heart. It was ironic and funny to think that the so-called demon was sitting in front of him and having breakfast with him. They were discussing how to deal with him in front of him. Everyone exchanged a few words and then left together. After they left, Felix looked at Dean. "What do you think?" Dean nodded. "Good." The chef next to them was secretly happy as he heard the words of the two. It was the first time that his cooking skills were praised by Felix. Dean asked Felix to take him to the prepared laboratory. The laboratory was very spacious and full of all kinds of instruments. It was enough for him to display his skills. "You can use it at any time," Felix said. "Use honorifics in private," Dean said. Felix was startled and bowed his head. "Yes." Dean left the laboratory after 2 glances. He didn't use it immediately. Instead, he asked Felix to take him to the factory and the production line to see the mecha. "The most powerful mecha we make here is the 9-tailed fox mecha. Qiuling has always been using it." Felix took Dean to the warehouse where the mecha were parked. Ferocious-like monsters were either standing or crawling here. Dean saw the recovered 9-tailed fox mecha standing alone in the innermost part of the warehouse. In just one night, the mecha had been repaired. "Is the 9-tailed fox mecha very strong?" Dean was a little surprised. He didn't feel it during the previous battles. Felix couldn't help but feel heartache as he thought of Dean's 2 consecutive defeats. The 9-tailed fox mecha didn't last long in his hands. He smiled bitterly. "This is already the strongest mecha we have here, and it fits well with Qiuling's magic marks. Her basic abilities are flash vision and multiple nerve. One is enhanced vision, which is equivalent to an enhanced version of dynamic vision. She can see every frame of a bullet fired from the chamber. The other is multiple nerves. She can multitask, and her nerve response is particularly sensitive, 3 times that of other dominators. This 9-tailed fox mecha happens to be a sensitive type mecha, so her abilities can maximize it. She also has the ability to scream and cause dizziness, right?" Dean asked. Felix smiled bitterly. "That's her core ability. It's not to cause dizziness, but to cause hallucinations. Maybe your physique is too strong so you only feel dizzy. If it were someone else, they would fall into an illusion. So, you also fell into an illusion at that time?" Felix nodded, and then a trace of coldness appeared in his eyes. "Those 2 bastards actually wanted to kill me as well. We spent a lot of money to cultivate them and let them enjoy their current status in life. Because you're not a king, you can't get their loyalty," Dean said. Felix was not convinced. "But I can give them everything they want. They shouldn't have betrayed me." Between betrayal and life, they chose their own life. "After all, interests are interests, not beliefs," Dean said in a teaching tone. Felix was startled, and suddenly came to his senses. Qiuling and Lucifer knew that he was being held hostage by Dean. If one of them got off the mecha, he would inevitably be killed by Dean. Therefore, in order to protect himself, they attacked him. Their plan was to get rid of him and Dean together. At that time, they only needed to say that he was killed by Dean, and there would be no proof. Although they would be punished in this way, it was obviously nothing compared to losing their lives. Thinking of this, Felix thought of Luke and the others. He couldn't help but feel some anger and inexplicable loss in his heart. The continuous betrayals made him doubt himself. However, after all, he was someone who crawled out of the consortium to take charge of things on his own. He had also experienced tempering, so he quickly put away his thoughts and introduced other mechas to Dean. In addition to the 9-tailed fox mecha, there was the ghost shift mecha. In addition, there were 2 4-star mechas, and most of the rest were 3-star and 2-star mechas. Only the headquarters is capable of producing 5-star mechas. Their combat power is comparable to the king of the demon race, Felix said to Dean. Chapter 1084. Felix smiled and said, "Then do you know how many creator mechas there are? How many pilots can operate the creator's mecha?" Dean was interested. "It's the Dark Age now and resources are scarce. All kinds of minerals in the Federation have been mined out. It's not like 300 years ago when human footprints were all over the world and we could find more materials. Felix smiled. The cost of building a creator's mecha is too high. Even our lock consortium has to be careful. A mecha pilot who can control a creator god is also very rare. After all, for an ordinary person's physique to reach the standard of a 5-star mecha pilot, not only does it require extremely high talent, but it also requires high-intensity training and hard work. Not a single one of these can be omitted. But the Protoss mecha we make are different. We use the corpses of the monsters as raw materials. The cost of building a 5-star mecha is less than 1/5 of the cost of a creator's mecha. Dean nodded. The cost of production is understandable, but the pilots of the Protoss mecha are trained here. Any one of them can operate the creator's mecha, right? They can but can't be controlled. Felix said. The 5-star mecha are the focus of attention of the people in the Federation. The same is true for the pilots. If we let a demon pilot the creator's mecha, it would be easy to be exposed. Moreover, the pilots are specially assigned by the military. Even if we put one in, they would be detected by them. Don't look at the fact that our consortium can meddle in the affairs of the military and even poach people from the military. But the demons are the bottom line of the military and the people. They can't be touched. Who is in charge of the military? The President of the Federation. Dean asked. Doesn't the military know that you are secretly studying the monsters? The people don't know and the soldiers don't know. But the President of the Federation and some generals know a little bit. Felix chuckled. Although this kind of thing can't be exposed, or else everyone will condemn us, the fact that our Lok Fei is making demon mechas is also beneficial to the Federation. We nurture the demons so that they can operate the mechas and attack the demons. This kind of benefit is in line with the Federation's main objective, so the President won't ask about it. This kind of dirty work is just right for us to handle. As long as we don't expose it and provoke public condemnation, there won't be any problems. Dean's eyes flashed. There was a silent sigh in his heart. He thought of the Holy Church and the Dark Church in Sylvia's giant wall. The world seemed to be always symmetrical in black and white. Or it could be said that it was a chaotic gray world. Because people distinguish the good, they define the other part as evil. It was just like humans defined elegance, so they had to define the other part as vulgar. Will the President of the Federation allow the cultivation of the demons and the monsters' mecha? Is there any agreement between you and them? Dean recovered from his thoughts and asked Felix. Felix nodded slightly. I don't know the specific content of the agreement, but we need to sign the military service contract for the monsters' mecha. In other words, the military has the right to requisition unconditionally in times of war. Will the contract still be valid at that time? I don't know about this. Maybe there are other supplementary agreements or checks and balances, but I'm just a small member of the Lok Consortium. I don't know much about these things. Felix shrugged. Dean carefully stared at him. He judged the truth of Felix's words through subtle expressions and muscle reactions. From beginning to end, Felix's words didn't show any signs of lying. Under Felix's introduction, Dean went to the assembly line workshop that produced the mecha. He saw that the production workshop was mainly divided into 3 types. The first was the raw material processing workshop. This workshop was filled with the bodies of the huge monsters that had been transported. These monsters were dead, but their bodies were still relatively intact. Only a small part of them was damaged. The second was the assembly workshop. This was where the metal was processed into the modified monster's body so that the two were compatible. The third was the factory workshop. This was where the final details of the mecha were perfected, including the testing of the intelligence system, circuit testing, mecha weapon system testing and installation, and so on. There were many subdivisions of each workshop. For example, the assembly workshop was divided into intelligent assembly and metal assembly. There were many rooms inside, but there were not many workers. Each worker was behind a huge conveyor belt, wearing metal gloves and special glasses. They could observe the tiny tissues inside the magical object through the equipment. Then, they used the mechanical arms connected to the metal gloves to install the wires into the magical object. It was equivalent to an extremely delicate surgery, and it was extremely difficult. Do you want to go to the training room? Felix saw that Dean had finished visiting the mecha workshop and suddenly suggested. Dean glanced at him. No, go back and rest. Felix was surprised by Dean's stare and nodded resentfully. The reason why he suggested that Dean go to the mecha training room was because he knew that the trained mecha operators had demon abilities. Among them, there was no lack of people with powerful perception. Perhaps they could see through Dean's identity and bring him some trouble, but it seemed that they were seen through. Returning to Felix's room, Dean found some wound medicine to speed up the healing of his shoulder injury. At the same time, he said to Felix, "Is the day of the battle coming soon?" Felix was shocked and hurriedly said, "I'll get them to withdraw it right now." "No need." Dean waved his hand. "A sudden cancellation will attract attention. Proceed as usual. Pick a mecha with similar ability to me and dress up as me. Then let someone drive the nine-tailed fox mecha to fight. Finish the fight quickly and kill quickly. This way, the end of the competition will be more natural." Felix's face changed slightly. He thought for a moment and said, "I understand. In addition, give me the information about the demons you trained," Dean said. Felix felt uneasy, but still agreed. The next day. Chapter 1085. Felix didn't take Dean to the viewing platform but went directly to the monitoring room in the back. He saw that Dean was calm and wasn't surprised at all. He once again whipped Luke's family in his heart, then pointed to one of the monitoring rooms and said, "This is him. His name is Lucien." There were technicians in the monitoring room, so he naturally put on the airs of a CEO. Dean was a little more respectful. He looked at the monitor and saw Lucien sitting under the viewing platform, bored to death. He picked his nose and put it in his mouth to eat. Everyone in front of the monitor was speechless. Lucien was burly and had a rough face. There were a few claw scars on his arms and neck, leaving dark brown scars. He looked very ferocious, with thick eyebrows and big eyes. Because he hadn't taken care of himself for a long time, his hair was disheveled, and his face was full of beard. He looked a little depressed. "What's his ability?" Dean asked. Felix said, "According to our observations and tests, his ability is flames. He can instantly change the structure of the fat in his body, producing a special type of oil. Through the friction of his muscles, this oil will rapidly ignite and be released from all parts of his body. Furthermore, he won't hurt himself, and a special membrane will form on the surface of his body to protect him. In addition, he has thermal vision and a set of special combat technique." Dean nodded. Fire-type magic marks were relatively rare. It should be similar to the Dragon Warrior, which was more inclined to attack and destroy. After watching for a while, Dean didn't stay and didn't say goodbye to Lucien. He left with Felix. On the third day, Dean felt that his shoulder had almost recovered. He brought Felix to the laboratory he built and asked him to accompany him as an assistant. Then he operated the equipment and drew blood from his body for testing. In addition, he cut a piece of flesh and used it as an incubator. Then he took out the parasitic soul worms in the factory, selected one, and planted it into this piece of flesh. There were a lot of parasitic soul worms in this factory, which were used to cultivate demon mecha operators. However, they didn't classify these parasitic soul worms, and they didn't even know what the corresponding abilities of these parasitic soul worms were. In this aspect, it was far less complete than the Shunluo Empire. Therefore, whether or not they could obtain powerful demon abilities depended on their own luck. Dean could not identify these parasitic soul worms, so he could only choose randomly. Felix was watching Dean's experiment from the side. He knew that Dean was monitoring him, but he could also take the opportunity to see Dean's secrets. But he didn't expect that Dean wanted so many experimental instruments. His purpose was to study himself. Felix had a strange feeling that this devil seemed to be very different from the others. After several days of research, Dean's harvest was great. As he had guessed before, the genes in his body had completely mixed with the origami factor. In each cell there was a nucleus composed of the origami factor. It had a strong devouring ability. It could invade the germs that invaded his body. His antivirus and anti-germs ability had greatly improved. In addition, his gene chain was very strange. It was actually composed of different genes. After these genes were analyzed, they were impressively several groups of magic mark genes. One of them was the gene of the origami factor. In other words, his whole body was now composed of the origami factor and magic mark genes. There were also some of his own genes, but the proportion was only 1/3. This discovery made Dean's hair stand on end. If he absorbed more and more magic mark abilities, would the part of his body that belonged to a human become less and less? In the end, would he still be a human? However, what made him glad was that all his thoughts were still in the state of a human, and he also had the 7 emotions and 6 desires of a human. Subsequently, Dean used the cut part of the flesh to cultivate the parasitic soul worms. After continuously inoculating a variety of parasitic soul worms genes, he found that the gene chain in that piece of flesh was more complex. But to his surprise, the proportion of his human genes did not decrease. It was still about 1/3. Later, after repeated observation, Dean knew the reason. Although he added a variety of parasitic soul worms, the genes of these soul worms devoured and merged with each other, and did not spread. The origami factor occupies 1/3, the soul worm gene 1/3, and myself 1/3. Dean looked at the condition of his body, and felt a little strange. He tried to add dozens of soul worms in a row, but the proportion of the soul worm gene in that piece of flesh still did not increase. It was still 1/3. This result surprised him a little. Later, he found that the genes of these soul worms were extremely similar, which was why they could fuse with each other. Simply put, these soul worms seemed to be a complete body. Every soul worm was like a part of a complete body. This discovery made Dean a little shocked. Could it be that all the soul worms came from the same mother? Or could all the soul worms be recombined into a giant soul worm? He knew that these parasitic soul worms were born from the extreme ice worm. Didn't it mean that these extreme ice worms also came from the same mother? Thinking of this, Dean suddenly became a little excited. If all the parasitic soul worms came from the same mother, in other words, controlling this mother was equivalent to controlling all the soul worms on Earth. This was a discovery that was enough to shock the world. Because this was a shocking discovery that might help mankind recapture the Earth. Dean crazily retrieved all the stored parasitic soul worms from the factory for verification. The result was that without exception, all of them could fuse with each other. He did not know if all the soul worms in the outside world were like this, but at least he felt that he had grasped a great clue and weapon. If he used it well, he might be able to completely destroy these demonic worms that invaded the Earth. But soon, Dean woke up from this state of madness, and then felt extremely bitter. Only he knew the secret, but he couldn't disclose it to the public. The 7 kings of the empire were controlled by the demonic worms. This was a secret, but what was the secret of the highest level of the Federation? He had no way to know. If he announced it rashly, it might bring disaster to himself. This feeling was like holding the secret of saving the world in his hands, but he could not become the savior. He could only hold the secret in his hands. Perhaps this was a sin? But he felt helpless. He could not even save the person he loved the most, so how could he save the world? Even if he saved the world was not his, so what was the point? Chapter 1086. The experiment continued. Dean was ready to find the secret of the origami factor. In addition, he also wanted to know why the part of his human genes could always be maintained at 1/3. Could it be that his own genes were comparable to the origami factor and the soul worm? In order to verify this, Dean asked Felix to find several test subjects. These test subjects were poor refugees bought by Hosk from the refugee area. Most of them were in their teens. Their families could not afford to support them, so they could only sell their children for money to support other children and adults. When these children were sent here, their bodies had already been washed. They wore plain clothes, but they did not look dirty. They were just very ordinary. However, there was no lack of beautiful girls among them, and they were rather eye-catching among the many test subjects. The purpose of these test subjects was naturally to be used for biological development experiments in the factory. Among them, the talented ones might also be selected, implanted with magic marks, and cultivated as mecha operators. Dean saw these children and thought of himself, as well as Barton and others in the orphanage. If they were born in the Federation, they might face the same situation. However, although he was a little touched, there was no pity in his eyes. He selected 2 of the more robust teenagers as his test subjects, implanted origami factor and soul worm in their bodies. If it was successful, it would definitely be a great opportunity for these children, and they could become strong in one leap. When lying on the operating table, the 2 children were obviously a little nervous. Their black and white eyes were full of fear and a trace of pleading. However, in the face of the indifferent Dean in the white coat, their pleas were directly ignored. The operation was very successful. Dean successfully transplanted a part of his origami factor into the 2 children's bodies, implanted them with magic marks, and then observed the changes in their bodies. He found that the origami factor and soul worm were fighting with each other in their bodies, but they seemed to reach a delicate balance, each occupying half of their bodies. This situation was a bit similar to his. However, before Dean turned his eyes away, the first child who finished the operation suddenly turned pale and trembled on the bed. The next moment, a large amount of blood suddenly sprayed from his wound, dyeing the hospital gown red. Then, bright red tentacles broke out of his body, like the claws of a monster, twisting in the wound. However, it didn't take long for these tentacles to shrink, age, and then lose their moisture and luster. The child's body also stopped struggling and moving. He had already stopped breathing. This scene not only scared the second child who was doing the experiment, but it also scared Felix. Although he had seen some biological experiments before, none of them seemed to be so bloody. Dean sighed with regret. He quickly took out the dead body of the child and dissected it to find the reason for the failure of the experiment from his genes. Felix didn't know if Dean's sigh was a pity for the child's life or the failure of his experiment. He sat next to Dean and watched his busy figure on the operating table. He felt his scalp tingle and had the urge to escape. It didn't take long for Dean to find the reason. The origami factor had swallowed the soul worm and also the cells in the child's body. Most of the organs in the child's body had disappeared. Many of them were corroded by the corrosive liquid. The origami factor and the soul worm couldn't reach a complete balance in the child's body. At this time, the same thing happened to the second child's body, and he died tragically on the hospital bed. Dean dissected it, and the result was the same. He was surprised, so he asked Felix to find a strong guard to be the test subject. This time, Dean wasn't in a hurry to experiment. Instead, he thought about the transformation of his body by Crimson Moon and what Crimson Moon had said to him. Their idea was to create a god. With the help of the ice worm's super healing ability, the cells could undergo a cycle of division and reorganization. After thinking for a night, Dean carried out the experiment on the guard the next day. This time, the order was somewhat different. He first instilled the guard with magic marks, cultivated him into a hunter, and then instilled a small amount of origami factor into him. Finally, He used the uranium substance to help stabilize the origami factor in the guard's body. However, when the experiment progressed to this step, an accident occurred. With the help of the uranium substance, although the origami factor in the guard's body was stabilized, the soul worm's cells suddenly rioted and swallowed the origami factor suppressed by the uranium substance, growing rapidly. The strengthened soul worm gene made the guard's body unable to bear it. Many of the important organs in the body quickly froze. Some were frozen, some showed signs of frostbite, and some accelerated division, turning into strange tissues. Strange! This situation was beyond Dean's expectation. He hadn't even started the god-making experiment yet, but it had failed? Even with the help of the uranium ring, the guard could still die? Was it because his physique was too weak? Dean thought of the time when he ate the flesh of the origami in Amelie's tribe. At that time, he was still a dominator. He immediately asked Felix to call over one of the two remaining dominators in the factory. This person was called Yumek. He had light yellow hair and a Western face. His expression was cold, with a bit of arrogance. After entering the laboratory, he nodded slightly to Felix and then glanced at Dean. He didn't take the initiative to speak. In his view, Dean was Lucifer. Although he had replaced Xiao Ling as the mecha operator manager, there was no need for him to flatter him. Maybe the next time Dean died, the position of manager would fall to him. Are we really going to use him? Felix looked at Yumek with some hesitation. After all, this was a dominator-level mecha operator that they had painstakingly cultivated. They had spent a lot of effort on him, and Dean's previous test subjects had all died without exception. He wasn't optimistic about Yumek's fate. Yumek looked at him suspiciously. He didn't know why Felix, as the CEO, would ask Dean. It gave him the feeling that he couldn't make the decision. Let's use him. Anyway, he's just a dominator. There's nothing to be reluctant about, Dean said casually. Yumek was furious and shouted, Lucifer, what do you mean by that? Don't think that you can do whatever you want just because you saved the CEO. If it was me that night, not only could I have saved the CEO, but I could have also caught the demon. If you have the ability, then fight me fairly. Noisy. Dean came in front of him. Under Yumek's angry gaze, he suddenly reached out his hand. It seemed slow, but in an instant, he grabbed Yumek's neck and lifted him to the operating table. Yumek's mind was blank. He didn't see Dean's movements at all, but the 5 fingers on his neck were as hard as an eagle's claw. It made it hard for him to breathe. He was horrified. How can you have such strong strength? Shoo! Dean made a gesture. While Yumek was stunned, Dean suddenly punched his temple. Yumek's brain buzzed and he fainted on the spot. Chapter 1087. Dean's first step was to replicate Yumek's original state, then analyze Crimson Moon's thoughts and give him the God creation experiment. However, something unexpected happened again. As soon as Yumek's body was implanted with the origami factor, a mutation occurred. His body rapidly decayed, and his death was as tragic as the others. How could this be? Dean was completely puzzled. It seemed that the difference in physique was useless in the face of the origami factor. Why could Yumek, who was also a master, not absorb the origami factor, but he could? Was it because of Splitter's magic mark? He couldn't figure it out. Suddenly, the scene that flashed through his mind when Crimson Moon read his memories appeared in his mind. In the familiar laboratory, his parents' faces and their slightly wriggling lips. His heart suddenly twitched fiercely, and he felt a suffocating pain. The next moment, he flipped over the operating table in a rage, smashed everything around him, turned around and left the laboratory. Felix was frightened, but he still obediently followed behind Dean. However, he didn't dare to get too close, lest Dean would vent his anger on him. What kind of experiment is he doing? Why is it so difficult? Felix's eyes flashed as he looked at Dean's back as he walked in front of him. From the time Dean kept asking for test subjects, He could see that Dean was changing different test subjects as materials. However, even Yumik, who had a master's physique, couldn't resist it. It showed how dangerous this experiment was. In the next few days, Dean didn't continue the experiment. His emotional performance was very unstable, which made Felix feel frightened. He wanted to escape from Dean, but he was afraid that such an action would anger him. The inseparability of the two attracted the attention of other high-level personnel, but no one dared to rashly ask. There were even some rumors, such as that Felix liked men. As for why it wasn't said that Lucifer liked men, the reason was very simple. When the two stood together, Felix's handsome face always looked a little feminine, unlike Lucifer's rough. It was obvious at a glance who had a problem with their sexual orientation. These rumors naturally fell into Felix's ears, which made him twitch with anger. However, he couldn't take the initiative to provoke his anger, so he could only grit his teeth and swallow the bitter fruit. Chairman, Mr. Farrow, the financial group's consultant, will arrive at 11 tomorrow. Felix's secretary relayed the news from Mr. Farrow's secretary to Felix. She glanced at Dean, who was sitting on the sofa next to her. There was a trace of jealousy in her eyes. Felix had always doted on her before Dean came, but now he basically didn't invite her into his office outside of work hours. She was completely put into the cold palace. Dean felt an inexplicable hostility and recovered from his thoughts. He glanced at Felix's secretary and slightly frowned. After a moment of careful examination, he found that there was no killing intent in the hostility, so he let it go. He was too lazy to interrogate. "Mr. Farrow is coming?" Felix was shocked, and then he was secretly delighted. This way, he would have a chance to spread the news of this place. He immediately nodded and ordered, "Prepare a sumptuous lunch tomorrow. Mr. Farrow's favorite foie gras. Remember to fly it over on time tomorrow morning." The secretary nodded and left. Felix breathed a sigh of relief and turned to Dean. "Farrow is a special consultant of the consortium. He comes to inspect twice a year. It's June now, so he should be here to evaluate our performance in the first half of the year. I'll entertain him." Dean nodded and didn't say anything. Felix was relieved to see that Dean didn't stop him, but he secretly sneered in his heart. The next day, a white man came to the factory with 2 bodyguards. Felix and several high-level executives greeted them on the ground. To Felix's surprise, Dean didn't follow them. It seemed that he didn't want to show his face in public. Felix guessed that Dean should have taken into account that Farrow's bodyguards had demon abilities and was worried that he would be exposed, so he went into hiding. This was just convenient for him to pass the news. The more he thought of this, the happier he became. He hugged Farrow and went to his own restaurant at the bottom of the factory. Several high-level executives accompanied Farrow to eat and drink. During this period, Felix secretly passed the information he had prepared to Farrow by clinking glasses. Farrow was puzzled, but when he saw the look Felix gave him, it seemed that there was another reason. He quietly put away the information. When the dinner was over, Farrow returned to the room that Felix had arranged for him. He opened the note and saw the contents. "What? The demon kidnapped him and is lurking around him? And it's a demon at the level of the Lord of the Abyss." Farrow's face changed. He was a little horrified. He even suspected that this was Felix's prank, but he thought that Felix wouldn't dare to play such a big joke. He immediately paced back and forth in the room. In the evening, Farrow found an excuse and said that the inspection was over. He hurriedly left with the 2 bodyguards and took a helicopter to the ground. After the helicopter took off, Farrow gave Felix a look and told him to stabilize the situation. Felix nodded slightly, and the 2 tacitly waved goodbye. When Felix returned to the factory, he found that Dean wasn't in his office. He immediately asked his secretary. The secretary was angry to see that Felix was looking for Dean, but he could only answer honestly. "Mr. Lucifer said that he's in the laboratory and that no one should disturb him." "Laboratory?" Did he go to do those damn experiments again? Felix shuddered as he thought of the tragic deaths of Dean's test subjects. At this time, he noticed the secretary's flirtatious eyes and the slightly open collar. He could see the two halves of her snow-white skin. He felt the blood pressure in his body suddenly rise. During the period when he was captured by Dean, he had been in fear every day and had been suppressed for too long. Today was a rare opportunity to leave Dean's sight, so he could be presumptuous. However, the evil thoughts in his heart surged and were extinguished. This was a rare opportunity, and he couldn't waste it on a woman. He quickly found someone to make arrangements and was ready to evacuate at any time. "Mr. Farrow, why are you in such a hurry to go back? Didn't you say that you were going to play here for a few more days?" the helicopter pilot asked Farrow. He had long heard that the test subjects here were good, and wanted to take the opportunity to play tonight. He didn't expect to leave before the sky was dark. "A demon has escaped and kidnapped Felix," Farrow said with a gloomy face. The helicopter pilot was startled and said in astonishment, "How is that possible? I saw that everyone in the factory is in good order. There's no feeling of being kidnapped at all." "That's the scariest part." Farrow took a deep breath, his blue eyes full of fear. "This demon has occupied this place. If I hadn't run into them today, I don't know how long they would have occupied this place. Also, this is the Lord of the Abyss. The headquarters would have to send at least 2 5-star mechas to rescue Felix from his hands." Hearing this, the pilot sucked in a breath of cold air, and the expressions of the 2 bodyguards next to him also changed. "Hey, what's that?" Suddenly, the pilot exclaimed as he looked at the display on the radar. The base of the helicopter suddenly exploded, and Farrow, who was sitting inside, was pierced by the debris on the spot. The violent impact hit him, and his body turned into meat paste. The 2 bodyguards reacted, their faces full of fear. They had just entered the demon's body when a black shadow quickly attacked and passed over them. Their bodies were cut into 7 or 8 pieces and scattered in the air. The pilot was so scared that his face turned pale. He yelled and operated the helicopter, trying to stabilize the crash, but a sharp blade suddenly stabbed out from behind the seat and pierced through his head. The helicopter roared as it fell. The throttle was ignited and it exploded. A figure appeared in the flames. It was Dean. His palms ignited with flames, and he patted the bodies that were burning with gasoline, burning them to ashes. There were no traces left, and there was no way to know how they died. Chapter 1088. While Felix was preparing the route of retreat, he sent his personal guard to squat outside the laboratory to wait for Dean and report to him immediately if there was any movement. However, not long after the guards he sent out left, they came running back. Felix's heart skipped a beat when he saw the guard rushing back. The guard hurriedly said, "President, Mr. Lucifer isn't in the laboratory. I asked the guards, and no one saw him go in." Felix's heart sank. The next moment, he suddenly thought of Failer who had just left, and his face changed. "President, were you looking for me?" At this time, a light voice was heard. Felix instinctively shuddered. He looked up and saw Dean slowly walking down the steps with a smile on his face. He was very easygoing, but Felix could feel the chill in Dean's eyes, as if he had fallen into an ice cave. After standing there for 2 seconds, Felix reacted. His face took a 180-degree turn, and he squeezed out a smile. "Where did you go? I was just about to find you." When the surrounding guards heard this, they all cast strange looks at Felix. Felix was in no mood to pay attention to anything else at the moment. His heart was pounding, and he was full of panic. He was afraid that Dean would kill him on the spot. This demon was overbearing and cruel. He couldn't use common sense to infer anything. "Then let's go to your office to talk," Dean said. Felix's face was pale, and he nodded. All right. The 2 entered the office and closed the door. The soundproofing effect of Felix's office was very strong. Unless there was a loud quarrel inside, One wouldn't be able to hear what was said even if they stood by the door. After all, these people had ordinary physique. Dean sat down on Felix's office chair. Seeing that no one was gossiping outside, he put his ear to the door to eavesdrop. Then he said to Felix, "Are you going to sneak out? You're a very smart person. Why do you always do these stupid things?" Felix's mouth twitched. He suddenly felt that his lips were a bit sour recently. He touched his mouth and smiled bitterly. "How could I sneak out? We're in the wilderness, and there's nowhere to run." Dean saw that he didn't admit it, so he didn't continue to ask. He sighed. "There is such a big opportunity in front of you, but you treat it as a danger. This is why you are ordinary until now. The opportunity is in front of you, but you can't grasp it." Felix froze for a moment and was confused. Dean said that he was ordinary, which made him speechless. He was the president of the Hosk Company in Copper Ship City. Even the mayor of Copper Ship City had to be polite to me and call me brother. How could this be called ordinary? How do you expect those people who are quietly building society to feel? He could only keep this thought in his mind, not daring to refute it. He innocently asked, "Opportunity? What opportunity?" Dean was speechless. "Am I not your opportunity?" Felix was dumbfounded. He was puzzled, but he didn't dare to rashly ask for fear of angering Dean. After thinking for a moment, he tactfully asked, "Although you are powerful, but I'm just an ordinary person." "I really don't understand." Dean suddenly felt that he might have chosen the wrong person. He was silent for a moment, and then said with an indifferent expression, "I can make a deal with you. I'll let your status in the locked consortium rise to the position you've always dreamed of, and I also need you to help me a little. After all, my identity in the Federation is somewhat sensitive, and it's not suitable for me to appear in public." Felix suddenly realized that Dean was looking for him to cooperate. "The opportunity he's talking about is cooperation. No, this is not cooperation. He wants me to become his puppet and help him lurk in the Federation." Felix instantly sobered up and his heart went cold. His first reaction was to refuse, but he was afraid of angering Dean, so he immediately prepared to use a tactful way to express himself, or to promise first to stabilize the demon. Suddenly, a thought emerged in his mind. "With the help of the demon's power, maybe I can climb to a higher position in the family." As soon as this idea came out, he was shocked. He hurriedly abandoned the idea, not daring to think about it. It had to be known that the crime of colluding with the demon was the most serious crime in the Federation. Although he had cultivated the demon in private, it was completely different from colluding with the demon. Cultivating the demon was the business of the Lock Consortium, and the Consortium would bear the responsibility if something went wrong. But colluding with the real demon was not only a violation of the interests of the people, but the 4 consortiums were also victims. No one would stand on his side and bear the responsibility for him. Dean quietly looked at Felix. Although his face remained calm, his slightly trembling eyelids, his pounding heartbeat, and the accelerated secretion of cold sweat from his pores all showed his nervousness and uneasiness. He didn't disturb him, but quietly waited for him to sort out his thoughts. After a while, Felix's violently beating heart gradually calmed down, but it was still beating very fast. "I'm a little curious. Why didn't you talk to me about cooperation in the beginning?" Dean looked straight into his eyes and said, "Because the moment I came out of the cage, I wanted to kill everyone here." Felix took a light breath. He felt the air was cold, and his heart was about to freeze. He suddenly thought of Dean's indifferent eyes when he was doing the experiment. It seemed that there was no emotion in his eyes. It turned out that in his heart, he had already regarded everyone in the factory as dead people. If this place was completely slaughtered, then Dean's whereabouts would naturally be hidden. "Then why did you change your mind?" Felix swallowed his saliva and asked in a trembling voice. Dean thought for a moment and said, "Because I think you still have some value." Felix was startled, and his heart inexplicably relaxed a lot. But suddenly he became nervous again. Did Dean see his value because of the deal they just talked about? If that was the case, then refusing the deal was tantamount to suicide. I promise you. Felix didn't think much and happily agreed. As long as he could get rid of Dean, there would be ways to punish him in the future. Locke Felix, 26 years old. He was born in the Locke Consortium. His father is a director of the consortium. Unmarried. He graduated from the Royal University of Shenyang. He has a PhD in Mecha Department. Dean spoke in an indifferent tone. How do you know? Felix was inexplicably shocked and involuntarily interrupted Dean's word. Dean indifferently said, You are not the only one here who is willing to submit to me. But you never left me. Felix couldn't help but shout. But you need to sleep, Dean said. Felix was startled. He understood that when he was sleeping, Dean had contacted others. Thinking of this, his heart was filled with bursts of cold air. He had slept many times. Who knew how many things he had done in such a long time? He suddenly felt that the people around him weren't worthy of trust. No one knew if there were traitors among them who were on Dean's side. Chapter 1089. Your father is one of the 13 directors of the Locke Consortium, and your father has many children. You are by no means the most outstanding one among them. Your brother serves as the regional president of the 8 cities in North China, and your sister serves as the president of the Hosk branch in Trot City. Their status is higher than yours. Dean tapped his fingers on the table and slowly said, If you cooperate with me, you can squeeze them out in the future and inherit your father's position. Otherwise, you will fail in the competition. As for the consequences of failure, you know it in your heart. Felix's face turned ugly. Dean had spoken to the bottom of his heart. Although he was a top figure in Copper Ship City, young and loved by local rich businessmen, everyone had their own difficulties and pressures. His pressure came from his brother and sister, who were better than him. Needless to say, his brother was the president of the Northern China District. His sister's Trot City was also one of the 12 star cities in the Federation. It was far from being comparable to his frontier Copper Ship City. It was rich in resources and had a large population. Naturally, the contacts were extremely wide. In the future, in the competition for his father's position, it was enough to push him to the ground and rub him. If we cooperate, what do I need to do? Felix asked. Dean indifferently said, I need a legal identity in the Federation. Then I will operate with this identity and become a new big group in the Federation. At that time, the power of this group will be divided to your side. This is your power, and also your trump card to compete with your brother and sister for your father's position. I will use this group to continue to snowball and get what I want. If you are obedient enough, maybe in the future you will not only get a small position on the board, but the chairman of the entire Locke Consortium. Felix's eyelids twitched when he heard the word chairman. His heart suddenly surged, but he quickly calmed himself down. The chairman of the Locke Consortium was a real giant in the Federation. Naturally, it was his dream goal. But in all fairness, he knew his ability. Being able to inherit his father's position on the board was already the limit. The Federation isn't like the demons. The order here is strict. It's very difficult to become a big group in a short time. Money isn't easy to earn. Felix calmly said. He wasn't confused by Dean's flattery. Dean could infer the changes in his mentality from his heartbeat. Although he was tempted, but he was able to restrain himself. Dean's eyes showed a bit of satisfaction. You don't have to worry about this. I have my own way. Order is like a collar on the neck of ordinary people. Some people are willing to wear it and some don't. Felix's expression changed slightly and he said, Don't do anything rash. You might be very strong, but there are surveillance cameras everywhere. If something happens, it'll be very easy to track you down. Who said that I'm going to use force? Dean didn't want to say more. Did the 4 consortiums abide by the rules of the game set by the president? No, but they can get the Federation president to change the rules. Felix was startled. He couldn't help but frown as he understood the meaning of Dean's words. He really couldn't figure out how Dean could operate a big group if he was given an ordinary Federation legal identity. Even he couldn't do it. After all, the business and social class here had been solidified. It was impossible to break it. Occasionally a small local tyrant would be born, and they would rely on some opportunistic businesses to develop. Even if there were innovative businesses or plans that had the significance of reform, they would eventually be acquired by the big consortiums. The big consortiums could only taste the sweetness. I can cooperate with you if you don't use violence and don't kill innocent people. Felix hesitated. Dean indifferently smiled, got up and patted Felix's shoulder. Figure out your situation. Either pay absolute loyalty and cooperate with me, or choose another path. Protect your Federation and Consortium, and then die without a complete corpse. After the memorial service is over, no one will think of you again, except your creditors. Felix's face slightly changed. His eyes flashed. I promise you. In that case, prepare my identity in 7 days. A clean resume will do. I have to be around 20 years old. It would be best if I graduated from a biological research university and have no family ties, Dean said. Felix nodded. That's easy. Dean knew what kind of power and corruption were contained in the word easy. He smiled. In addition, we will sign another contract. This is our cooperation contract. I will need your financial help in the initial stage, but not too much. Felix knew that the contract was to tie him to the same boat. He sighed in his heart. He knew that he couldn't get rid of Dean. The demon was smarter than he had imagined, and seemed to understand the Federation's system very well. It was difficult for other demons to understand the Federation even if they explained it to them. After all, it was a different culture and system. It was difficult to master in a short period of time. But Dean seemed to be like a fish in water. He suspected that the demon had long gotten information about the Federation and was a high-level spy sent by the demons. However, this had nothing to do with him. He only hoped that Dean could fulfill his promise. He had no other choice. Dean didn't imprison Felix anymore. He had blocked the latter's retreat. He believed in his vision. Felix wasn't a person who would sacrifice his life for justice. He absolutely wouldn't have the idea of dying together with him. After all, he was a child of a business family. The concept of interests was deep-rooted, and his mind had long been corrupted. Dean came to the laboratory. Before leaving, he was going to do one last experiment. He was going to check his heart, for lumps had grown on the golden heart, and they hadn't subsided yet. He used his X-ray vision to check the situation inside, but found that all he could see was a turbid golden color. It wasn't as clear as before. He always felt that there seemed to be something inside his heart. Sometimes he would hear inexplicable heartbeats, and with his own heartbeat, it was 2 heartbeats at the same time. He gave himself a CT scan, but it didn't work. He could only do a heart test. The harvesting operation was very dangerous. Moreover, he had to do it himself. The posture was very inconvenient. Dean asked Felix to send people to guard the laboratory. After he was ready, he applied an excessive amount of anesthetic to himself. He felt his chest gradually go numb. Then he began the operation. He melted the skin of his chest, turned into a magic knife, and carefully cut the ribs in front of his chest. He tore open the muscle membrane and saw the beating golden heart inside. Chapter 1090. Dean carefully cut the surface of the golden heart. After feeling that there was not much discomfort in his body, he moved the knife to cut one of the meat lumps. After the heart membrane on the surface of the meat lump was cut, it automatically shrank to the bottom of the lump, revealing the lump inside. It turned out to be a hard object, not the pus or other liquid that Dean imagined. Moreover, the shape of this hard object was very strange, like an eyeball meatball. But looking closely, the surface of the meatball was stained with blood, and there were small protruding sharp corners. Dean frowned slightly and felt a little disgusted. After all, this thing was growing on his body, and it was in the most secret part of his heart. He took a deep breath and cut the other 3 meat lumps one by one. He found that 2 of the meat lumps were wrapped in black tentacles, very small and messy. At first glance, it looked like the tentacles of an octopus that had shrunk countless times. Under each tentacle, there was a translucent crescent-shaped hook. This hook was very tender, like cartilage, but Dean felt a creepy chill. He had killed a lot of monsters, including the cubs of monsters. This cartilage hook was clearly a sharp claw that had not yet grown. He suddenly had a strong sense of fear. At this time, the second heartbeat that would appear from time to time sounded in his ears again. His pupils shrank, and he had an impulse to cut the heart completely to see what was going on. But he knew that if there was an accident, he would die. Adjusting his breathing, Dean held his breath and cut a small piece of the edge of the heart from the edge of the heart, which would not affect his life. Then he quickly pulled the heart membrane with the hook scissors and sutured the heart. As soon as the heart was sutured, Dean saw that the wound was healing. It was estimated that in less than an hour, the suture could be removed. He even felt that the suture seemed to be decomposing by the heart, and he did not need to remove it. After all, the suture was also a tendon extracted from the tail of the monster, and could be digested. Dean was not in a hurry to test it, but used the ultrasonic painting instrument next to him to check the situation in the heart. Soon, the intelligent painting board next to him showed the appearance of the heart. The drawing was vivid, like a photo taken by a camera, with bright colors. When the picture went deeper, Dean suddenly saw an unforgettable scene. A thumb-sized head appeared in the middle of the golden heart. There was a human head in his heart. This scene almost made Dudian jump up. After a long time, he looked at the thumb-sized head. It was a very white baby's head. The eyes were closed, and the eyelids were transparent. He could see the eyes inside, but the eyes were golden. It seemed that the eyes were staring at him through the eyelid membrane. It was full of strange and unspeakable horror. Apart from the head, the baby's body had also grown. The 4 lumps of flesh were its body. 2 of the lumps were like meatballs the size of eyeballs. They were 2 tightly clenched fists, and the protruding horns were its fingers. Inside the other 2 lumps of flesh were octopus-like tentacles. They were messy and ferocious, extremely strange. What is this thing? Dean could not help but take a light breath. Even though he had rich experience, he was frightened by the strange horror at the moment. Moreover, this thing was growing on his body. It made his scalp tingle and the blood in his whole body solidified. He thought that his heart was overloaded, and there was a small problem. He didn't expect the picture to be so horrifying. Could it be that this little thing already existed in his heart? But it didn't appear before. His overloaded heart caused the blood flow to accelerate, and at the same time it accelerated the growth of this little thing, causing it to grow 4 limbs. It was horrifying no matter how he thought about it. Dean's back was cold. He stared at the strange heart baby for a moment. Suddenly, his pupils shrank and he exclaimed, "Is this an origami?" The upper body of the baby was a human, but the lower body was like an octopus with messy tentacles. He could not help but think of the origami that he saw in the giant wall of Sylvia and the other giant walls, including the origami in Amelie's tribe. There was a baby origami in his heart? And he didn't notice it at all. If it wasn't for the overloaded heart that caused 4 lumps to grow, he didn't know how long it would take for him to notice the existence of this thing. Perhaps it would grow unknowingly until it broke out of his heart. Dean's face turned pale as he thought of this. Even though it was a baby origami appeared in his heart, but it was too horrifying. Could it be that all the origami are born like this? If this is the case, then there are a lot of people with special conditions like me? Dean's face turned green. If it was really like what he speculated, then the water of the Empire was much deeper than he imagined. The Seven Kings might not be the ultimate fighting force of the Empire. After all, if it wasn't for the burden of his heart, his physique was enough to burst out the power of a king. He had already verified this point after many experiments. If every origami came from the body of an existence like him, then how many origami would there be in the Empire? Each giant wall had one, and there were at least dozens of giant walls, or even hundreds of them. This meant that there would be hundreds of kings, and all of them were cultivated by the Empire. But why were the Seven Kings ruling the Empire on the surface? Dean's thoughts were in chaos again. If the other origami were dead, then why didn't they resist? Moreover, his body modification experiment was completed by Crimson Moon, and Crimson Moon's experimental knowledge came from her creator Biolello. Although part of it was combined with the super chip technology from the old era, but that technology was only a supporting role. It couldn't be the core technology and concept of her God creation experiment. Biolello was the former king of the Empire, so it was impossible for him to transform himself into a vessel for breeding origami. What was the problem? Dean's mind was in chaos. He wanted to overturn the operating table in front of him. He had a lot of troubles, and now there was such a thorny problem. How should he take out the thing in his heart? Would the heart fail if he took it out? Chapter 1091. Half a day later, the gene chain in the heart was analyzed, and Dean had a more intuitive understanding. The main composition of the heart was the origami gene. There was no part of his human genes in it, but there was a lot of soul worm genes that he absorbed and the cell residue of the ice worm. In addition, there was a strange dormant cell in the heart. He speculated that it was part of the origami gene, but he didn't know what kind of changes it would bring to him after the dormant cell was revived. As for the origami in the heart, Dean used deep radio wave drawing to map out the situation inside its body. He found out that the young origami had a heart the size of a mung bean, and the heartbeat frequency was extremely slow. Occasionally, he heard the second heartbeat, and it was coming from this mung bean-sized heart. The power of the vibration was not inferior to his golden heart. Dean always had a feeling that this was a devil living in his heart, and it could break out at any time. According to the composition of the heart, Dean asked Felix to transfer a large number of test subjects to conduct experiments. After breaking out the structure of the heart, he had a new idea that needed to be verified. The hundreds of test subjects that were used for the demon race cultivation program were quickly used up. When he had more than 90 test subjects, Dean's experiment finally had a breakthrough, and the result gave him a glimmer of hope. My guess might be right. The origami in the Empire have been sealed for a long time, and they were all origami that had fallen in the war of the old era. In that era, humans didn't have the technology to cultivate origami. Moreover, Sylvia's origami were sealed in the freezer, which proved that they came from a place with extraordinary technology. Including the king of the ice worm, the origami sealed in the giant wall of the Empire were probably from another planet, just like the demon worm. But the origami in my body was artificially cultivated. Maybe it was a coincidence. Even Burrow and Crimson Moon didn't know the results of the experiment. Their theory was correct, and they used the devouring and integration nature of the origami gene as the core of the god. But they didn't predict what would happen when the origami gene and the incredibly tenacious ice worm were mixed together. From the results in front of me, it was resurrection. The genes of the soul worms are similar, and they are both tough and resilient life forms. The origami factor instinctively swallowed and fused with the extreme ice worm, inheriting the tenacious life force of the extreme ice worm, and came back to life. Therefore, a new life was born in my heart. Origami reproduce asexually. They don't need to mate. And now the experiment has finally come to fruition. If I can complete it, I can create origami. This speculation was completely different from the first idea he had. But Dean felt that the possibility was higher. Moreover, the experiment on the test subjects had shown him the light of hope. It proved that his experiment was feasible. If he was given enough time and resources, he felt that one day he would be able to create artificial origami. To him, this was an unexpected and huge surprise. The origami were born with top-notch combat power. In the old era, they were able to quell the invasion of the demonic insect. If such a combat power was in his hands, he would definitely be able to overthrow the current regime and establish his own dynasty. At that time, not only would he have the strongest combat strength, but he would also have the greatest freedom. He could use all of his resources and strength to find a way to resurrect the walking corpses. The more Dean thought about it, the more excited he became. For the first half of the day, he felt that death was approaching. His heart was filled with despair. But now he felt that the world had opened a new door for him. He saw infinite hope. It just so happens that I want to start a group. I can carry out my experiment in this federation. Dean's eyes flashed as he thought. He ended today's experiment, and the excitement brought about by this new conjecture gradually subsided. His gaze returned to himself. This was the biggest problem at the moment. It was impossible to remove it while preserving the heart, but if he removed the heart, he would definitely die. This seemed to be a dead end. However, now that his vision was higher, and he had been using the computer to absorb the scientific and technological knowledge of the Federation, he did not despair. The heart needed to be removed, but he could find a new heart to replace it after it was removed. Heart transplant surgery was not a secret in the Federation. It was the patent of the rich. Today's technology in the Federation was advanced. This kind of surgery that was involved in the authoritative hospitals of the old era was now very perfect. However, Dean knew that his physical condition was special. Transplanting the heart of an ordinary person into his body wouldn't be able to withstand the pressure of his own body. It was like putting a chain on a sports car. It would collapse at the start. It could only suppress the heart of a magic scar warrior with a physique of the abyss level. But the Federation didn't have much experience in this kind of surgery. After all, the rich were all ordinary people. Dean had a toothache as he thought about this. He felt that there were too many things that he needed to develop. Fortunately, although the situation was bad, it wasn't extremely critical. Moreover, he tried to control the rate of blood flow to slow down the heartbeat and reduce the consumption of the heart. He didn't need to go through a big fight in a short period of time, so there shouldn't be any problems. It's time to leave. Dean looked around the laboratory. He printed out all the experimental data and the computer log record. Then he removed the backups, closed the laboratory, and left. When you see the devil in your heart, you are already a devil. Dean pushed open the door to Felix's room. He saw Felix holding a book in his hand and reading it. He casually sat on the sofa and poured himself a glass of juice to moisten his throat. Felix saw Dean and immediately put away the book in his hand. His face was not as nervous as before. Now that the two of them were cooperating, he knew that Dean wouldn't hurt him. So he relaxed a lot and felt that he had found the long-lost freedom. "Is the identity ready?" Dean asked. Felix was surprised. "You want to leave so soon? Do you want me to stay a little longer?" Felix smiled. "Of course." Dean rolled his eyes. He was too lazy to tease him. "Prepare as soon as possible. Also, I'm going to see the demon tonight. I want to talk to him." Felix thought for a moment. "Okay." Chapter 1092. Dean came to the viewing platform and saw Lucian lying lazily inside. He smiled and said, "I heard that you are a subordinate of the Light King. Why are you captured here?" His voice was transmitted to the cage through the loudspeaker device. Lucien said lazily. It's none of your business. I'm also from the Empire. I want to understand the situation with you. Dean was still calm. Lucien sneered and said, I don't care who you are. Don't disturb my sleep. Dean thought for a moment and said, I know. He turned to leave and had Felix bring him to the mecha warehouse. He saw that the mecha inside were a dazzling sight. The nine-tailed fox mecha operated by Chiu Ling had already been repaired. He immediately boarded the mecha and used the special code provided by Felix to cancel his original login. Then, he entered his fingerprint and retina to log into the mecha's AI warehouse and initiate the connection. Boring tricks. Lucien rolled his eyes when he saw that Dean had really left. He had been locked up here for years. These aliens had used all kinds of means to torture him. They had used beauty, alcohol, torture, intimidation, and so on. He had survived all of them. Instead, he felt that it was a bit ridiculous. Although these means were good, they were too weak. This time, they actually sent someone to pretend to be one of their own. It seemed that they had exhausted all their tricks. Click. At this moment, the passage opened. Lucien slightly opened his eyes. He was a bit surprised. Was he going to open the magic mecha again? Why didn't they inform him in advance? At this time, a nine-tailed fox crawled in from the passage. The metallic luster on its tail was suffused with cold air. Lucien's eyes flashed a trace of seriousness. He had fought with this nine-tailed fox mecha before. Its strength was not inferior to his. Was the opponent planning to use force? Humph. Lucien sneered in his heart. Although his physique hadn't improved after being locked up here for years, his fighting skills had become more and more simple. He was confident that he was much better than other upper abyss masters of the same level. Even this nine-tailed fox mecha might not be able to suppress him. Moreover, he already knew that the weaknesses of these mechas were all in the core cockpit. As long as he killed the people in the cockpit, he could stop this thing. It's been a long time since I've sent someone to die. Today, I'm tired of living again. Lucien grinned hideously and stood up from the ground. His whole body was demonized like a flaming lion. His amber-like pupils narrowed, flashing with sharp murderous intent, and he suddenly pounced at the nine-tailed fox mecha. Strike first and gain the upper hand. Nine-tailed fox's mecha suddenly rose into the air. Like a white shadow, it leaped over Lucien's head. When Lucien looked up, he saw that nine-tailed fox's sharp claws were actually grabbing onto the metal wall of the cage. She was sprinting on the wall, her 9 tails flashing. It was a little dazzling. Lucien was shocked. This time, the 9-tailed fox seemed to be more agile than before. He took a deep breath, and the flames on his body became much more vigorous. Staring at the 9-tailed fox carefully, he suddenly pounced at it. Whoosh! The 9-tailed fox flipped in the air and landed on the ground somewhere else. Lucien's attack failed. He landed on the ground and sneered. What, did your master send you here to run laps? At this moment, 9-tailed fox rushed over head-on. Lucien was slightly startled. He did not expect his opponent to be so easily provoked. Then he was overjoyed, burning with vigorous flames. Like an angry lion, he slapped the ground and bit at 9-tailed fox's neck. Bang bang bang! Suddenly, a few white shadows flashed quickly in Lucien's sight. The next moment, a violent force came from his chest, and he could not resist it. Lucien felt that the silver-white wall in his sight was moving forward rapidly, and it was his body that was retreating at an extremely fast speed. With a bang, his back hit the wall, and the shock made his spine hurt. Before he fell, a few white shadows flashed and hit his chest one after another. The bones in his body felt like they were shattered, and the pain almost made him pass out. He coughed up a large mouthful of blood. Lucien looked up and saw a spiral-shaped foxtail in his sight. Because it was twisted into a spiral shape, the tip of the tail looked extremely sharp, like a sharp awl suspended in front of his forehead. Dense killing intent came from the eyes of 9-tailed fox. Lucien felt his heart tighten, and his body overflowed with cold sweat. He did not dare to breathe. The next moment, Nine-tailed Fox put away its sharp tail and quietly crawled in the same place. At this time, a dull voice came from its chest. "Do you have time to talk to me now?" Lucien's pupils shrank and his eyes widened. This voice belonged to the previous person. He took a deep breath. He knew that the other person was controlling Nine-tailed Fox and had shown mercy. However, he also knew that the other person would not dare to kill him. He sneered. "You haven't come to me for so long because you have secretly cultivated a big killer. Humph, don't think that you can get anything out of my mouth. I have already said everything that should be said." Nine-tailed Fox's chest split open, and inside was a cockpit with surging flesh walls. Several blood vessel-like tentacles lifted the pilot's chair. Dean sat in the chair and quietly looked at Lucien. "Do you want to live?" Lucien looked at Dean, and his eyes gradually showed surprise. "Are you really from the Empire?" Dean didn't speak. His whole body was covered with sharp black blades. Spiky armor grew all over his body, including the top of his head. He looked like a monster with sharp blades all over his body. His pupils were slightly red as he felt the heat in the air. "I can save you, or I can let you die here. It depends on whether you are willing to listen to me or not." Lucien's pupils shrank, and he felt the unusual feeling mixed in Dean's demonic body. He said in horror, "You are the Abyss? No, you are the Lord of the Abyss? You can think of it that way." Dean indifferently said, "These aliens can't cultivate the Abyss. They don't know the cultivation method of the Abyss. Your demonic body is so thorough that even if you are not the Lord of the Abyss, you are at least the upper Abyss like me." There was some surprise in Lucien's eyes. "You are from the Empire, but why do you operate the mecha? Why are you here? Where are they?" At this time, he found that there were no guards outside. He suddenly had a guess in his heart. "This is my territory now. I have seen your records. You were arrested 9 years ago. The criminal level evaluation is 3S. You have the strength of the upper Abyss." Dean indifferently said, "I want to know why you were arrested. As a subordinate of the King of Light, why did you come to the War God's Wall to participate in the border war? What kind of critical battle happened 9 years ago? Also, tell me about the King of Light." Lucien was more sure that Dean was from the Empire when he heard Dean call the War God's Wall, because the aliens only called it the Magic Wall. Lucien changed his expression and smiled. "So it was a misunderstanding. Since we are on the same side, let's leave here first." Just as he was about to get up and approach Dean, a murderous aura suddenly enveloped him, making all the hair on his body stand up. He saw Dean looking at him coldly as if he was looking at a dead body, which made his heart feel cold. "We are all from the Empire. Not all of us are on the same side. I want to know whether you are a spy of the Empire, a traitor, or an innocent person," Dean said in a cold voice. Lucien's face slightly changed. He looked at Dean and said, "You seem to have a grudge against the King of Light. I won't tell you about the King of Light even if you kill me." "Then go to hell." Dean retracted the piloting chair back into the mecha. Nine-tailed Fox was ready to make a move. Lucien's face suddenly changed. He quickly shouted, "Misunderstanding, misunderstanding! I was just joking. To tell you the truth, I was sent by the King of Light to reinforce the War God's Wall. But I also have a secret mission. That is to take the opportunity to sneak into the aliens' territory. I didn't expect that my mission would be exposed. I was caught in the process of sneaking in and was sent here. How can I believe you?" Dean said in a cold voice. Lucien said with a wry smile, "It's true. There is a rift between the aliens in the border guard. I suspect that there is also a rift between them in the Empire. Moreover, the position is very high. It might be a king." Dean's face slightly changed. He frowned. "Are you trying to provoke the relationship between the kings?" "I want to know about the King of Light and the Empire," Dean shouted. Lucien wryly smiled. He told Dean about the deeds of the King of Light. Dean asked about the situation in the Empire. Lucien answered in full detail. But there were some doubts in his heart. It seemed that Dean didn't know much about the Empire. Lucien became more and more scared. Was this a real alien? If so, didn't it mean that the aliens had mastered the method to cultivate the strength of the abyss level? This was by no means good news for the Empire. He secretly complained in his heart. Unfortunately, he couldn't pass the news back. He didn't lie to Dean. He was indeed a spy sent by the King of Light to sneak into the Empire. He deliberately leaked his mission to another king's men. Then he was exposed and arrested. He was waiting for the opportunity to leave so that he could pass the news to the King of Light. A moment later, Dean drove the nine-tailed fox mecha and left. He just wanted to take this opportunity to understand the situation of the King of Light and the Empire. The result was that he knew more than he expected. The King of Light turned out to be an Imperial spy. Moreover, the situation in the Empire seemed to be more complicated. The Federation's spy had infiltrated the top level of the Empire. Did this mean that the Federation's top level had also been infiltrated by the Empire? The level of science and technology in the King City is really not inferior to the Federation. It's just that they deliberately suppress the technology and prohibit private research. All the power is concentrated in the hands of the Seven Kings. The Seven Kings are puppets of the demonic insect. It seems that the demonic insects are deliberately suppressing the technology. What's the reason? Dean sent the nine-tailed fox mecha back to the warehouse. He walked and thought. Suddenly, his heart shivered. Since the Seven Kings are controlled by the demonic insects, why are their forces still fighting each other? Is it that these demonic insects are not united? He thought of the results of his previous experiment. His heart suddenly became more chaotic. After returning to Felix's office, Dean temporarily suppressed the chaotic thoughts in his heart. He said to Felix, "I'm going to take Lucien out." Felix was surprised. "Why? If we let him out in case he wantonly destroys. I want him to destroy outside. I want to see the Federation's security forces and see some reactions," said Dean. Felix was startled and then felt a trace of chill. He hesitated for a moment and said, "The Federation's security forces are stronger than you think. In case he is caught, it's easy to thoroughly investigate that he escaped from here. It'll be hard for me to absolve myself of the blame. It's very likely that I'll be relieved of my position. No one will be able to help you then." Dean said, "I've thought about it. Just modify the identity data that he entered into the computer. When the time comes for a thorough investigation of Hosk's factories, I'll find a singer to take the blame. It should be able to fool them for the time being." Felix smiled bitterly. "Since you've thought of a thorough investigation, it means that you've thought it through. But it's a small matter if the higher-ups thoroughly investigate our factories. I can conceal it, and it's not difficult to modify his identity data. But what if he is captured alive and confesses?" "Don't worry. A madman won't talk," said Dean. Felix was startled. He suddenly felt a chill spread all over his body, giving rise to a layer of goosebumps. "In addition, give me a detailed map of the city where your two dear brothers and sister are located, including the location of their factories. It's not just a simple map. I want to know the distribution of the various forces inside," said Dean. Felix's eyes lit up. "Are you going to deal with them?" Dean smiled at him. Felix nodded. "I'll give it to you later. But don't make too much noise. In addition, it's best not to deal with both of them at once. Otherwise, Father will suspect me. Don't worry. You just have to cooperate with me." Dean patted him on the shoulder. He certainly wouldn't deal with both of them at once. Otherwise, how would he listen to him without checks and balances? 2 days later, Dean officially left the factory. In these 2 days, he and Felix had dealt with the matters in the factory. They had covered up the news of his original escape, including the records of his capture. Felix had even sent people to the city's border to erase their entry and exit record. In this copper ship city, Felix could be said to cover the sky with one hand. It was not difficult to hide from someone. Dean and Lucien left the factory in the car and went to the city center along the maple leaf-covered road. Lucien was sitting in the front passenger seat. He was very honest. From time to time, he touched the black collar around his neck. He smiled bitterly. Even without this, I won't show off. This is the Federation. How can I cause trouble here? The black collar was put on by Dean, and he bluntly told him that it was a monitoring device. Once he caused trouble, he would activate the collar and his position would be exposed. Exposing his position in the hinterland of the Federation was no different from courting death. After trying it out, Lucien found that the material of the collar was the same as the cage that imprisoned him. He couldn't destroy it. This was also a tool made by the Federation to enslave the real demons. A moment later, the car arrived at the slum town at the edge of the city. Chapter 1093. What else do you think it is? Dudien casually asked. Lucien smiled. I thought that there were only a few human traders among the aliens. I didn't expect that there would be so many people in this small town. Is it a force composed entirely of humans? Don't you know about this information? Dudien was surprised. Lucien was unhappy with his question. If I knew, then why would I be a spy? I only know that there are a few human traders among the aliens. I didn't expect them to be composed entirely of humans. So what is the meaning of our fight? Isn't it the meaning of our war to rule the same race and enjoy the resources alone? Dudien said. Didn't your parents teach you to be a man of the people? Lucien frowned. There are monsters lurking outside and we are still fighting amongst ourselves. When will we get real peace? Dudien looked at him. He was a bit surprised. He didn't expect this rough-looking man to have such ideals and belief. As a spy he had sworn to defend his life. Dudien patted Lucien's shoulder. He couldn't help but regret that he was going to bid farewell to Lucien. But the plan wouldn't change. Although he appreciated Lucien a little. The car left the slum town and went to other small towns. Suddenly Dudien saw a face on the roadside. He stopped the car and rolled down the window. Su Ming's sister? Su Mingzhu was shocked. She turned to look at Dean in the car, but found that she didn't know him. But the car the latter was in was a symbol of status. She was a little nervous and excited. She whispered, Do you know my brother? Dudien nodded. Your brother has been accepted by Hosk's company. If anyone comes to you for debt, tell them to go to Hosk's company to find your brother. Su Mingzhu's eyes widened in shock. My brother has been accepted by Hosk's company? Really? Dean was once again aware of the influence of Hosker's company. He nodded. Go back to Hosker's company and tell them that you are looking for your brother. They will settle you down. You don't have to live in such a broken place. After saying that, he scanned the surroundings. This small town was similar to the other poor towns. The environment was harsh and the streets were littered with trash. There was even a pair of underwear with mud stuck to it by the gutter. It was probably the handiwork of some great thief. Living in such an environment, not to mention the serious air pollution, the water was obviously not pure enough. No wonder Su Mingzhu had lung cancer at such a young age. Su Mingzhu's eyes widened. She felt like she was in a dream and stood rooted to the ground. Do you have a communicator? Dudien asked. Su Mingzhu came back to her senses and quickly said, Yes. Remember this number. Dudien gave her Felix's number and waited for her to input it. Contact him if you have any problems. Tell him that Qin Mo introduced him. Su Mingzhu was startled for a moment and quickly bowed to thank him. Her eyes were moist. She didn't doubt Dudien's words. After all, she was poor and had no money. Her brother was a soldier. The average trafficker wouldn't be able to kidnap her. Moreover, she recognized the logo of the car. It was a high-level mechanical car made by Haas. The other party had given her this number. Obviously, he had considered that she would be kicked out of Haas's company. If it was another big shot, he might casually say a few words, but he wouldn't be so careful. "Are you good friends with my brother?" Su Mingzhu cautiously asked after thanking him. "Yes." Dudian thought, "I killed your brother. Can I be considered a good friend?" Su Mingzhu still wanted to say something, but Dudian had already rolled down the window. The car hummed and the mechanical engine roared. It instantly sped up and left the street. "Brother!" Su Mingzhu's eyes were full of hope as she watched the tail of the car disappear. She felt that the world had changed from gray to colorful and full of hope. She fantasized about meeting her brother again. At that time, she must personally make his favorite dumplings to eat. "You seem to have sneaked in here for a long time," Lucien said with interest. Dudian nodded. "I sneaked in with the identity of a mecha operator. This girl is his sister. Her parents are divorced. Her mother ran away with a rich man. Her father's debts were all left to his children. Her brother was killed by me. If the debtor knows that her brother is dead, he will definitely force her to die. Maybe he will use her body to pay off the debt." Lucien was a bit surprised. He didn't expect Dudian to tell him this in such detail. He didn't think much about it as he nodded. So, this girl is indeed very likely. Moreover, she even thanked the murderer of her brother. It's really ironic. Her future life will be beautiful with the help of Hosk's company. Even if one day she learns that her brother is dead, the pain will eventually fade. She will find her lover and continue to live her life. Dean casually said. "So, you're quite kind." Lucien laughed. Dudian laughed. "I have always been very caring. But I am picky about my partner." "That's right. If you have love for everyone and treat everyone equally, then what's the difference between you and a beast? At least you have to treat your parents and lover better than others, right?" Lucien laughed. Dudian casually asked, "Do you have a lover? Do you think I am ugly?" "No, I'm just worried that the world can't understand your beauty." "Haha, I like to hear that." The two chatted as they drove to the city center. Their relationship seemed to be like old friends as they talked about everything. After arriving at the city center, Dudian parked the car in a square and took Lucien to the nearby maglev high-speed rail. The high-speed rail arrived quickly. Dudian used the federal identity that Felix had given him to buy a ticket. The new identity was called Chin Mo. He was a student majoring in biology at a famous university. His parents were divorced and he was an only child. His identity was roughly in line with Dudian's requirement. Felix couldn't find a perfect match for him because of the time constraint. As for the real owner of this identity, he may not be alive at the moment. Although there was still 1 year left before graduation, Chinemo had reached the stage where he didn't need to report to school every day. Those of the same age as him had already entered the company for an internship or started their own business. Chapter 1094. North Desert City? Lucien was surprised to see the place he was going. "Where is this?" "If I remember correctly, the place we are at seems to be the closest city to the border. Why don't we leave directly from here?" "This city is called Copper Ship City, and it is one of the border cities. North Desert City is the hinterland of the Federation," Dean said. "If we leave from the border, we can reach the War God's Wall quickly. But how terrifying are the defense forces there? It is impossible to leave with just a temporary identity. We can only go to the black market to buy a legal identity." Lucien was slightly startled. He looked at Dean with a bit of suspicion in his eyes, but he was not sure. His first instinct was to suspect that Dean had joined these people and deliberately lured him to their core city. However, Dean said that they were going to the hinterland of the Federation, so Lucien was not sure about Dean's thoughts. "With the mecha in the factory, he can easily subdue me. Taking me to the hinterland of the Federation shouldn't be to deal with me. Maybe it's true. Lucien secretly speculated. The maglev train shuttled between the skyscrapers of Copper Ship City and drove out of Copper Ship City. The endless wilderness appeared through the glass windows of the train. The scenery of the wilderness stretched as far as the eye could see, making people feel relaxed and happy. Many people in the train exclaimed. Some people who left Copper Ship City for the first time looked at the wilderness with excitement, full of yearning and curiosity about the outside world. Dean saw that the maglev train was moving towards the boundless wilderness along a transparent pipeline. The pipeline was erected on the high wall of Copper Ship City. There were hundreds of meters of ground below the train. Once it crashed, no one would be spared. The train route is not buried underground, but built high in the sky. Is it more dangerous underground than high in the sky? It is difficult to guard against monsters that burrow into the ground, but bird monsters that fly high in the sky are easy to detect. Dean thought. He passed the question to Felix through the communicator, and soon Felix gave him an answer. It turned out that the god of science and technology of the Federation had created an ultrasonic resonator that could release harsh sound waves that were unbearable to monsters. But the effect of this thing was not obvious in the underground, so the train would pass from high in the sky. Even if flying monsters appeared, they could use the resonator on the train to scare them away. The train was safe and sound. 2 hours later, they arrived at the next city. Along the way, some people saw monsters appearing in the wilderness outside, but their vision was hundreds of meters away, so they couldn't see clearly. This made them feel excited. After 12 hours or so, the train finally arrived at North Desert City. The periphery of the city was a desert, hence the name. Green plants were sparse, and most of the soil was sand and stones. Dean saw many small monsters living in the desert sand. He also saw a team of mecha operators hunting monsters outside the desert. This scene was naturally seen by other passengers. Some seemed to be accustomed to it, while some were so excited that they leaned on the window to look. "Let's go." Dudian took Lucien off the train and followed the flow of people into the city. He hired a car on the side of the road, got in and ordered, "Go to Asima Corporation." As the middle-aged balding driver started the car, he asked in surprise, "You're employees of Asima? That's amazing. Does Asimir pay well?" Dudian casually replied, "Not bad." Lucien, who was sitting next to Dudian, seemed to be interested and asked, "What do you think of Asima Corporation?" Dudian glanced at him, but didn't stop him. The balding middle-aged driver was excited. He did not hide the envy in his voice. Of course, Asima is the most famous company in Mo Bay City. They have the support of the big financial group, Tesla. Once you join Asima, your status will be upgraded to first-class citizen. Not only that, the tax exemption alone is enough to make people jealous. Third-class citizens like us have to pay half of what we earn, sigh. Lucien laughed. "Do you know what Asimir Corporation does?" The middle-aged balding driver was surprised. "Aren't you from Asimir Corporation?" "We're going to apply for a job." Lucien didn't wait for Dudian to open his mouth. Dudian frowned and said to the driver, "Don't be distracted, we are pressed for time. Don't delay our interview." The middle-aged balding driver saw that Dudian's face was indifferent. He didn't say anything but secretly sneered in his heart. What arrogance! He was just applying for a job. The car drove silently on the street. When it came to the front of a building under construction, the door was smashed open. Lucien, who was sitting next to Dudian, jumped out. Dean's eyes narrowed. The middle-aged driver was horrified. He slapped the driver's seat and headed to the front of the car. Then he flashed out of the car. The moment he left, he controlled the heat and detonated the car. The car that was running suddenly exploded. The other cars and passers-by were all frightened. They covered their heads and squatted on the ground. Some rushed to other places as fast as lightning, instinctively escaping. Dudian looked at the direction of Lucien. He took out a remote control from his pocket and gently pressed it. Bang! Lucien felt his neck suddenly burst. The severe pain made him scream. But the next moment, he felt his neck loosened. The solid metal locator had exploded and fell to the ground. He was puzzled, but his heart was relieved. He quickly ran towards a path. Although he didn't know what Dudien's purpose was, but through the middle-aged driver's statement, he knew that Dudien was definitely not taking him to the black market. Dudien lied to him, so he could only rely on himself. In fact, he never really believed in Dudien. He felt a trace of strangeness when Dudien told him everything. As a spy, his vigilance had always been very high. At this moment, he was running away with great risks, but he had already prepared for the worst. At worst, he would be caught again for interrogation. At that time, he would also confess to Dean. The sudden change in the street scared the passers-by. But soon the hidden alarm sounded. At the same time, the situation was sent to the North Desert City's Defense Department. Chapter 1095. Without a tracking device, I can hide in the crowd, and they might not be able to find me. However, I need to avoid the hidden cameras first. Lucien's mind was racing as he was running. Suddenly, he saw a large shopping mall in front of him. It was crowded with people. His eyes lit up, and he immediately sprinted towards it. The alarm went off outside the shopping mall. Although the guards did not react, the smart system detected Lucien's abnormal identity and sent out the alarm. Most of them were locals of North Desert City, and they had never left this place in their lives. For them, the war at the border was like another world. Their life was coffee, entertainment, and work. In the Confederation, the law was strict, and the crime rate was very low. There were basically no thieves or robbers. After all, there were cameras everywhere. For those under the age of 20, this was the first time they had heard the alarm in their lives. After a short moment of silence, the crowd suddenly became noisy. They hurriedly looked for the exit and prepared to leave the shopping mall. Although they did not know what was going on, the alarm meant danger and disaster. When everyone rushed towards the exit became crowded. This gave Lucien an opportunity. He aimed at the exit with the crowd and rushed towards it. His figure was as fast as a gray lightning. After he got into the crowd, he quickly twisted the muscles on his face, squeezing the muscles and fat into another face. Then, he used his fingernails to cut off his hair, and as for the hair that was cut off, he burned it to avoid leaving any clues. After doing all this, he took off his coat, pretended to be panicking, and rushed to a luxury brand store. Under the panicked and confused gaze of the shop assistant, he quickly took a set of clothes and went to the changing room. A moment later, an ordinary-looking man wearing a branded suit walked out. Although the shop assistant was panicking because of the alarm, she could not run away when she saw a customer. She bit the bullet and said, "Hello, sir. The price of this set of Forest Wolf men's suit is—" Lucien did not wait for her to finish and quickly ran out of the store. He was only a little faster than the ordinary people around him, but he did not stand out. The shop assistant was stunned for a moment, and then she cursed aloud. She did not expect that Lucien was trying to take advantage of the situation. She immediately chased after him, but it was not convenient for her to run in high heels. Very soon, her sight was blocked by the chaotic crowd, and she lost sight of Lucien. Lucien followed the crowd to the exit after getting rid of the shop assistant. He looked panicked, but his eyes were cold. Looking at the nervous faces of other people around him, he sneered in his heart. At this time, he heard a few girls next to him talking excitedly about the alarm, wondering if there was a fire in the mall or something like that. He felt that the noise was ear-piercing and incomparably unpleasant. There was a nameless anger in his heart, and he had the urge to strangle these little girls to death. However, his rationality told him that he had to endure. However, these few little girls did not have the slightest intention of stopping. They chattered non-stop. He finally could not bear it any more and shouted angrily, "All of you, shut up!" The few little girls did not expect that he would get angry. They were shocked and then a little angry. One of them, a long-haired girl, looked at him coldly and said, "What does it have to do with you what we are talking about?" She sounded like a boy and did not have the slightest image of a lady. Lucien was furious. He wanted to raise his hand and strangle her to death, but his rationality made him desperately endure. The blue veins on his forehead were bulging, and his face was frightening. The few little girls were frightened by his appearance and took a few steps back. However, the long-haired girl was not afraid at all. She comforted her companions and said, "Don't be afraid. If he dares to touch a single hair of mine, I guarantee that he will not be able to bear the consequences." The other few little girls suddenly thought of the identity of her father, and immediately lost their fear. At the same time, they found that although Lucien's face was scary, he was trembling with anger, and did not dare to do anything. He looked a little timid, and they looked down on him even more. One of the girls said, "Look at his ordinary clothes, he should be an ordinary elite. Humph, if he dares to speak rudely again, we will go to his company to complain about him and make him lose his job." A cold light flashed in Lucien's eyes. He clenched his fists so hard that they made cracking sounds. He suddenly roared, "All of you shut up, believe it or not, I will kill you all." Except for the few little girls, the people around him were also startled by his sudden roar. Among them, a strong young man who often worked out took a step forward and reached out to push Lucien's chest. He said, "Uncle, why are you shouting at a few little girls? What is the point of bullying women?" After being pushed by him, Lucien's brain suddenly exploded like an oil can being ignited. His eyes were red, and there was a feeling of blood filling the air. The strong killing intent made him want to go crazy and drown his reason. He did not even have time to think about why he suddenly became so irritable. However, the last trace of reason firmly restrained his fist, and the violent anger made his body tremble slightly. How can this person be like this? He is so rude. He is shouting so loudly, so rude. He is already dozens of years old, and he still bullies little girls. The people around him pointed at him and talked about him. If it was the previous Lucien, he would not care about the comments around him at all. After all, he was a trained agent spy, and he still had this little bit of tolerance. Moreover, he was on the run, and even if there were thousands of people cursing him, he could still bear it. However, at this moment, he felt that these comments were buzzing in his head, and he had an impulse to destroy everything and silence the world. His breathing became heavier and heavier, and the killing intent in his mind became more and more violent. "Get out!" The voice was almost squeezed out from between his teeth. The strong young man shouted, "Who are you telling to get out? Are you crazy?" After saying that, he pushed him again. "Get out!" Lucien suddenly exploded, and he suddenly raised his head. The bloodlust in his eyes was like two clouds of blood, like a trapped beast escaping from the abyss. When the strong young man saw his eyes, he suddenly felt a chill all over his body, as if he was being pricked by needles. He could not help but feel a sense of fear in his heart, as if he was facing an evil beast. The next moment, he felt a buzzing sound in his head. Bang! The young man's head was smashed by Lucien's fist. Brains and blood splattered all over the ground. Many of the brains splattered on the faces of the few little girls behind the young man. The slightly provocative expressions of the few little girls suddenly froze, and in the next moment, they let out ear-piercing screams. The surrounding people who were pointing and discussing were all shocked, and looked at this scene in horror. Their mouths were open, and they even forgot to breathe. This scene was too horrifying. Smashing the head with one punch, it was not something that a human could do. "All of you go die!" Lucien roared ferociously, and was the first to pounce on the few little girls who were scared stiff. With one hand, He grabbed the head of the long-haired girl at the front and pulled it in front of him. The long-haired girl's hair was pulled in pain, and she reacted and screamed, "Bastard, let go of me! Do you know who my father is? My father is—" Bang! Her voice suddenly stopped, and her head and jade-like face instantly exploded, smashed by one punch, like a cracked watermelon. Lucien was like a wolf in a flock of sheep. He strode out, grabbed the remaining few little girls, and with one punch smashed their heads. The surrounding people saw this hellish scene, and after they reacted, they panicked and ran in all directions. Scream, continue screaming! Lucien's face was stained with brain matter, and he looked like a demon. Looking at the people around him who were running away, he laughed and quickly chased after them. He lifted their clothes, and with one punch, some had their chests pierced, and some had their necks broken. These people were like pieces of paper in his hands, so weak that they could not withstand a single blow. In the blink of an eye, everyone around him was killed, and the scene was full of blood like purgatory on earth. Finally, it's quiet. Lucien closed his eyes as if he was intoxicated, and let out a light sigh, feeling comfortable all over. At this moment there was a rumbling sound, and suddenly, a beam of light shot over. Lucien felt the danger a second earlier, and instantly flashed, dodging the beam. Seeing the burn marks left on the ground, his face darkened, knowing that it was a mech, but he had no intention of escaping. He looked around, and quickly found the location of the mech, and said with a grin, "You too, be quiet." After saying that, he quickly rushed out. In the process of running, his body rapidly transformed, and like a burning lion, he rushed out of the shopping mall. At this time, he saw that in the plaza outside the shopping mall, there were actually 7 or 8 mechs surrounding this place. Kill. Kill. The appearance of these mechs reminded him of the painful experience when he was imprisoned by Felix, and the murderous intent in his heart intensified, and he pounced on the nearest mech. While Lucien and the mechs were fighting, the people around the shopping mall had been protected by the guards and robots, but there were still many people hiding in the tall buildings in the distance watching, and at the same time, recording the scene on their communicators. Dean also stood on a tall building to watch, and when he saw Lucien rushing toward the mech, he was relieved, and the corners of his mouth curved. It seemed that the drug had taken effect, and the time was about the same as he had calculated. In fact, inside the black ring on Lucien's neck was not a positioning device, but a kind of germ that he had concocted, which could make people anxious and crazy. Just as he had said to Felix before, he was going to release a madman, not a person. When the black ring exploded, it cut Lucien's skin, and the germ inside infected him. No matter how he hid, when the drug took effect, he would go crazy and expose himself. They can actually mobilize so many mechs so quickly. Is this the power of the city's defense? Dean looked at the mechs gathered in the plaza. He recognized the models of these mechs, most of which were produced by the Locke Consortium, but there was only one 4-star mech, and the rest were 3-star mechs, so it would be a bit difficult to kill Lucien in a short time. Soon, Lucien killed a mech, but he was also injured, and immediately rushed into the crowd outside. Through the demonized magic eye, Dean saw very clearly that Lucien's face was ferocious, and he was already in a state of madness, but his fighting instinct seemed to still be there, and he did not completely fight head-on, but planned to use the geographical advantage to destroy these mechs one by one. No wonder he is the abyss cultivated by the Empire. Fighting has long been embedded in his bones, and even if he is crazy, he will choose the best way to fight. Dean sighed in his heart. Lucien's speed was so fast that he quickly rushed into the crowd in the distance, and these onlookers were like paper, smashed in front of him, or thrown away casually. For a moment the onlookers fled in panic, and some ran in the direction of the pursuing mechs, hoping that they could protect them, but this had a great impact on the mech guards, so they did not dare to go all out to kill Lucien, so as not to trample these people to death. Lucien ran all the way, destroying many buildings along the way, and many passers-by were killed by him, causing more and more destruction. The Mechs could not display their full power in the crowded city, and were soon left behind. Dean did not chase, but used his thermal vision to track Lucien. Although he could not see Lucien, but the heat released by Lucien was like the sun. As long as he was in this North Desert city, he could see him at a glance. An abyss can run amok here. Such a thought rose in Dean's heart. Suddenly he found that the heat of Lucien in his eyes was rapidly decreasing, as if his life was fading away. He was startled, and stared at his heat source, and found that the heat was fading away more and more, and after 10 minutes, he was completely like an ordinary person. What was it that injured him so severely? He can't hide his heat source, and didn't move from the same place. Dean was surprised, and after thinking for a while, he did not rush to see, and was ready to wait for tomorrow's news in North Desert City. No matter what hit Lucien, he made such a big movement, and it would be announced on the news, to give an explanation to the public. At night, Dean immediately saw the latest headlines of North Desert City through the communication device, which showed the disaster scene in the shopping mall, and even a narrow exit, where a large number of bodies were scattered. The death was tragic. Dean saw that all the bodies were killed by a single blow, and knew that it was Lucien's masterpiece. What surprised him was that the picture in the video was not censored, and such a bloody scene was publicized without any treatment. At this time, the news anchor also talked about the matter of the demon, denouncing the demon's ferocity. Dean immediately understood that this was to train the awareness of hostility to the people of the Federation, and let the people of the Federation know the ferocity of the demon. No wonder the magic marks warriors of the Federation, such as Felix and Luke, were so afraid of the real demon. Most of them were influenced by this kind of news since childhood, and thought that the demon was extremely ferocious. At the end of the video, Dean saw the scene of Lucien being defeated. A beam of light fell from the sky of North Motian City. It was as if a meteorite was falling from the sky. It was incredibly fast and blasted Lucien to the ground. Is this a missile? No, it's a beam of light, but not a laser. Otherwise, with the size of the picture, Lucien would directly turn into ashes, and not slowly disappear as a heat source. Dean slightly frowned. He did not expect the hidden technological means of the Federation to be more terrifying than he had imagined. There was such a strong city defense weapon, and it could easily defeat an upper abyss. Even if the Empire attacked here, they could only disarm and surrender in the face of these city defense weapons, unless there was corresponding high-tech weapons, or the king dispatched to destroy the city defense weapons, and then send troops to attack. Chapter 1096. At the same time as Dudian was watching the news, several helicopters and more than a dozen chariots had arrived at the square outside another landmark building. All of them were specially trained combative police. Although they weren't magic marks, but they had been injected with a special serum made by the Federation. Their physique had been enhanced, but the extent of enhancement was far less than that of magic marks. They were only 2 to 3 times stronger than ordinary people. Don't underestimate the strength of 2 to 3 times the strength of an ordinary person. After the combative police got out of the car, they quickly surrounded the square, keeping a tight watch on the surroundings. The demon attack during the day had caused the entire North Desert City's secret defense forces to be stretched taut. Although Lucien had been killed, why did the demon appear? Did he have any accomplices? What was the purpose of his sudden exposure? These were questions that made the top figures of the North Desert City uneasy. General Yao. In front of a helicopter that landed, Li, the head of the Defense Department of Mo Bay City, squinted his eyes and saluted the burly middle-aged man who got off the helicopter. He then stepped forward to shake hands and greet him. I didn't expect the chairman to send you here. Looks like the demons are going to suffer. Yao Jie smiled and said, Not at all, not at all. Minister Li is too polite. The chairman has already contacted the mayor and sent me here to assist you in finding the demon's accomplice. This demon has already been killed. I heard that according to the results of the forensic autopsy, this demon's strength is comparable to a 4-star mecha and has reached the upper abyssal level of the demon race. This is considered a big shot in the demon race, but he actually took the risk to go deep into the hinterland and appear in our stomach. General Yao, this way please. It's windy outside. Let's go inside the house. Lily smiled and led the way. The two of them were accompanied by a group of secretaries and guards to the landmark building of the North Desert City. The security level of the building had reached the highest level in the Federation. It was said that even missiles wouldn't be able to hurt the people inside the building. The glass outside the building was made of gelatinous alloy glass. It was extremely tough. It was barely comparable to the hardness of diamond. Many high-end mechanical chariots and tanks used this kind of glass. It was a new invention of the Federation. The inventor of this invention had won a Lifetime Achievement Award and was included in textbook. After arriving at the building, Lili welcomed Yao Jie to the conference room. He ordered the secretary to prepare the materials and tea. General Yao, you've come all the way here. It must have been tough on you. If you need anything, feel free to tell me. We're all family, so there's no need to stand on ceremony. Lili laughed. Yao Jie saw that his secretary was dawdling in preparing the documents. He frowned slightly and said, Department Headley, let's not talk about other things for now. This time, the demon suddenly appeared in North Desert City. Not only has it attracted the attention of the chairman, but there are also many eyes here. I hope to know the identity of this demon as soon as possible. How did he come here? Who are his accomplices? I wonder if you have any results here? Seeing that Su Tao was in a hurry, Lili didn't continue the small talk. With a solemn expression, he said, After the incident, I immediately retrieved the surveillance footage. I'm ashamed to say that I couldn't see how he sneaked in. He seemed to have suddenly appeared in the shopping mall and started a massacre. From the surveillance footage, he disguised himself as an ordinary pedestrian and quarreled with a few girls before tearing off his disguise. Yao Jie knitted his brows. How is that possible? Your North Desert City is heavily guarded, and there are surveillance cameras everywhere. It's impossible for him to appear here out of nowhere. Have you investigated the records of the border? Lili nodded. We have, but there's nothing suspicious. The only suspect is a student. Not long before the incident, a taxi suddenly exploded. Through the slow playback of the surveillance footage, we found that the door of the taxi was pushed open. With such great strength, it must be a demon. That means that the demon was in the car at the time. We then investigated the records of the taxi and found a student and his friend. The two of them took the maglev high-speed train from Tongchuan City. If that's the case, then this student might be his accomplice. Yao Jie asked, Where is the student now? Have you interrogated him? Lili was stunned. With a strange expression, he said, How should I put this? In the beginning, this student was the biggest suspect. But after the investigation, we found that he should be innocent. Innocent? Yao Jie looked at him with confusion. Lili nodded. After the car exploded, he was flung out of the car. Luckily, he survived. Later, the demon appeared not far away and attacked the civilians. His reaction was no different from the others. He was quite frightened. Based on years of experience, our criminal investigation experts determined that he was not lying. We used the artificial intelligence to conduct a lie detector test on his behavior at the time, and the result was the truth. Then, the demon appeared at the mall. He fought with the city guards and escaped. He did not give chase. From these few points, even though he is a suspect, he shouldn't be the killer. At most, he was held hostage by the demon. Yao Jie was startled. He couldn't help but say, but he was in the same taxi as the demon and they both coincidentally arrived at Mo Bay City today. Just these facts alone are enough to capture him for interrogation. It's better to capture the wrong person than to miss out on any suspect. This is a demon we're talking about. Missing out on even one is equivalent to a disaster. Lily smiled bitterly and said, "Originally, I planned to capture him and interrogate him first, but the higher-up sent word that this person's identity is special, and he can't be a demon, so we don't need to divert our attention to him. Then, through some of his later actions, I feel that he really doesn't seem to be an accomplice of the demon." A message from the higher-ups? Yao Jie's eyes narrowed instantly. Who? The 4 financial groups? Lily shook his head. He raised his hand to point upwards but didn't say anything. Yao Jie's pupils constricted slightly. He was a little shocked. After a moment, the shock in his eyes slowly disappeared. After a moment of silence, he said, "Since it's from the higher-ups, it seems that he is indeed not a suspect. If that's the case, are there any other suspects or clues?" Lily nodded. "There are. When the demon appeared, there were a few bystanders who behaved strangely. They are a major suspect. Also, the forensic doctor dissected the demon's face and found that he had temporarily changed his appearance. There were obvious traces of twisting of his facial muscles. However, he was blasted by the true light cannon and his face was severely damaged. It would be very difficult to comb his facial muscles back to their original appearance. It will take some time." Yao Jie breathed a sigh of relief. "After the forensic doctor recovers his original appearance, we'll know what he looked like before. An upper abyssal definitely didn't act alone when he infiltrated here. There might be some despicable people behind him who tried to use him to do something. Unfortunately, he broke free." Chapter 1097. The actions of the other 3 consortiums have become more and more aggressive in recent years. Yao Jie's complexion turned slightly cold as he said, "I reckon that some people are already unable to sit still. The chairman is very concerned about this matter, and may want to punish the chicken to warn the monkey. You must investigate carefully and find out who is involved in the Devil Race's attack this time, no matter who it is. Otherwise, the chaos of corpses 80 years ago and the nuclear disaster 30 years ago will happen again." Lily's heart skipped a beat. He knew that the chairman was serious this time. As for why Yao Jie was talking about the 3 consortiums, he had already guessed the reason. The Terrace Consortium was not included, because the first leader of the Terrace Consortium was the god of science and technology. After the god of science and technology passed away, the forces under his command gradually formed the Terrace Consortium. It held the most secrets and weapons of the Federation, as well as the most advanced technology. It was the well-deserved number 1 consortium among the 4 consortiums. However, although the Terrace Consortium was powerful, it had always been low-key. It concentrated on researching technology and pushed the Federation's technology forward. More than 80% of the technological products in daily life came from the Terrace Consortium. In addition, it was said that all the previous chairmen of the Federation had been manipulated and assisted by the Terrace Consortium. The 3 consortiums had been afraid of the Terrace Consortium for a long time, but they didn't dare to confront the Terrace Consortium openly. No one wanted to be the cannon fodder of the other 2 consortiums, so they could only try their best to develop behind the scenes and try to replace the Terrace Consortium, or at least not be threatened by it. Why would such a troublesome matter appear in our North Desert City? Lily smiled bitterly in his heart. If this was the worst-case scenario, then he would also be involved in the battle between the consortiums. As the Minister of Defense of North Desert City, he looked impressive on the surface, but in front of such giants, he was just a small character. He could be removed from his position or disappear at any time. On the other side, Dean had just finished reading the news when the communicator rang. He picked it up when he saw that it was Felix. "Your operation this time is too risky." Felix's anxious, slightly reproachful, and helpless voice came from the communicator. He had chosen a video call, but when Dean picked it up, he switched to a voice call. Looking at a man's face at such a close distance made him a little nauseous. The movement this time is too big. I heard that the 4 consortiums are paying attention to this place. They will probably send a lot of people to thoroughly investigate. Even if you act secretly, there will be flaws and clues left. This is the Federation, and there are surveillance cameras everywhere. It's not your demon clan's territory, Dudian calmly said. Didn't you know before I acted? Don't panic. It doesn't matter if you find anything. As long as there is no sufficient evidence, then you won't be punished. You're too simple-minded. For this kind of operation involving demons, as long as you're related to them, they can beat you up and force you to confess. It's just like in the Middle Ages in the Old Era. As long as someone said you were related to a witch, whether it was the sheriff or the surrounding villagers, they would all think you were evil because of fear. Our Federation's fear of you demons is the same as the people's fear of witches at that time. Forget it, you wouldn't know even if I told you. Felix was a little annoyed. His attitude towards Dudian was not so humble and fearful through the communicator. Dudian indifferently said, if the wronged person was a noble or a landlord, the villagers and sheriffs wouldn't act rashly. Felix, who was in the factory office at the other end of the communicator, slightly opened his eyes. He was a little surprised. Dudian actually knew the history he was talking about? After a few seconds, he couldn't help but shout, "You're not really from the Federation, are you? Are you pretending to be a demon? No matter who I am, our identities won't change. Why do you care so much?" Dudian casually said. Felix almost vomited blood. To put it bluntly, no matter what my name is, I will always be your uncle. He held his breath for a while before swallowing his anger and faintly said, "We should be considered as partners now. Our status is equal. As long as you're happy." After a few seconds of silence, Felix took a deep breath and said seriously, "I'll go back and tell them that if they catch you, let them deal with you leniently." "No, it will implicate you." Dudian refused. Felix was startled. He didn't expect Dudian to say such enthusiastic words. He thought that even if he didn't help, Dudian would ask him. Was it because he was worried about implicating him and exposing his arrangement? But without his help, Dudian's Federation identity was that of a poor student. How could he get out of the military? Dudian hung up the communicator and didn't give Felix a chance to ask. Felix, who was at the other end, slightly opened his mouth. Looking at the watch that showed that the call had ended, he suddenly had the urge to curse. He felt that all the good qualities he had cultivated since childhood had been wasted on Dudian. If I'm a suspect of being a demon's accomplice, they should take me to the magic mark detection equipment. This thing is also available in the factory. I've tried several times, but it didn't detect anything. It shows that my physique is different from the average magic mark warrior. It's probably because the magic mark has been digested by the origami factor and doesn't exist on the surface. Dudian looked at the night sky outside the window and secretly thought. At this time, the communicator rang again. "I forgot to tell you that the entire North Desert City has been blocked. No one is allowed to enter or leave. You can only stay there for a while." Felix's voice came after the call was connected, but this kind of blockade can't resist the public opinion. It will be unlocked in a few days. Don't worry. If you are ready to rush out, it's best to lurk for a few days. It's not to the point of losing this layer of identity. Dudian indifferently said, and this blockade is estimated to last at least a week or even half a month. Felix was surprised. Why? The public opinion of the North Desert City is too weak compared to the public opinion of the entire Federation. Locking the city is equivalent to locking the demon's accomplice in the city. But unlocking the city is equivalent to releasing the demon's accomplice to the entire Federation. People in other cities won't do it, Dudian said. Felix was about to ask why Dean inferred that it would take a week. Just as he was about to ask, he suddenly thought of something. With the traffic and trade of the North Desert City, the blockade for half a month was the limit. Otherwise, the city would be cut off from water and food, and there would be a more chaotic situation. I didn't expect you to even consider this point. Felix sighed. He was about to say a few words of admiration, but found that the communicator had been hung up. His mouth slightly twitched. Chapter 1098. The demon attack was on the news, and the whole North Desert City was talking about it. It had become a hot topic in recent times. Dean rented a house in the commercial district with the federal coins that Felix had transferred to him. During the day, he wandered around outside. There were many large companies in the commercial district, as well as some seed companies of top group. He also saw several outsourcing companies that cooperated with Hosk's company to help produce mecha parts. There were also pharmaceutical companies that had some strange drugs. Life seeds, beauty needles, water pills. Dean looked at several pharmaceutical companies and suddenly had an idea. He immediately contacted Felix and said, "I want to open a pharmaceutical company." Felix knew that Dean was going to set up a company, but he didn't know what type of company he was going to set up. He couldn't help but ask, "Pharmaceutical company? You have to think about it clearly. Pharmaceutical companies are more troublesome than mecha companies like ours. Moreover, the market is saturated with pharmaceutical companies. Unless you can develop a new drug, there is no chance." "I know. Wait for me to transfer the money for the company," Dean said. Felix listened to his tone and knew that Dean didn't listen to his words at all. He rolled his eyes and said in a muffled voice, "I know." Dean hung up the communicator. Not long after, he received a notification from the communicator that a sum of money had been remitted to his account. He checked it and found out that it was 1 million federal coins. The remittance account was not Felix's, but an unfamiliar name. He knew that Felix was worried that he would be exposed and implicate him. Dean didn't act immediately after receiving the money. Instead, he wandered around the Science and Technology Park in the commercial district. There were many technology companies here. He strolled around and saw a lot of biological research instruments, such as microscopes, which could be seen everywhere. There were other special instruments that he had seen in the factory. They were more high-end than the ones sold here. They should be high-end products made by top technology companies. In the afternoon, Dean went to the Federal Bureau of Industry and Commerce to apply for a company and fill in the registration. "Please enter the company name," the smart robot at the counter said. The face of the robot was that of an Asian beauty. It looked no different from a real person. Dean thought for a moment and said, "Dream Company." Input completed. Verify name. Verification passed. The smart robot said, "Please submit the company address." Dean didn't submit it immediately. He left the Federal Bureau of Industry and Commerce and found the rental center in the commercial district. He rented an office building with an area of more than 500 square meters. This office building was ready-made. The interior was exquisitely decorated, but it was not cheap. The monthly rent was 80,000 yuan, which was higher than the annual salary of many border guards. After paying the rent and deposit, Dean made a copy of the rental contract. At the moment, it was late. The Federal Bureau of Industry and Commerce was closed and would never open at night. He could only wait until tomorrow to go again. "It's already been a day, but they still haven't come to arrest me. Looks like they don't suspect me." Dean left the office building and returned to his rented house. There was no trace of anyone entering the room. He felt a bit strange. Did the other party investigate his relationship with Felix, so they ignored him? That shouldn't be the case. If the investigation reached this point, they would probably interrogate him even more. After thinking for a moment, Dean still had no clue. He could only attribute the reason to the Federation's security force was too weak. That night, He used his communicator to connect to the internet and posted a recruitment notice on a rental platform. The next day, Dean prepared all the materials and went to the Federal Bureau of Industry and Commerce. He registered the company and received the business license. He returned to the commercial district and bought all the equipment he needed on the list. In the blink of an eye, another day passed. A few days later, the company was fully formed with all the necessary equipment. Dean's recruitment notice also played a role. 7 or 8 people came to apply for the job. Dean selected 3 of them, 2 men and 1 woman. The 3 employees looked at Dean, who was busy moving all kinds of equipment to the company. They were dumbfounded. They didn't expect to enter a new company. Moreover, the boss was so young. It seemed a bit unreliable. Unfortunately, they had signed the contract. It was too late to regret. They had to work for a full year or they would have to pay liquidated damages. "Boss, are we a pharmaceutical company?" Ma Jing was encouraged by the other 2. She bit the bullet and looked for Dean. She carefully asked, "Do you know what kind of medicine we are going to produce? What type? Do you have the formula?" "You don't have to worry about this. In a few days, the materials will be delivered, and you will have to work overtime every day for the first week. You should be mentally prepared. Of course, overtime pay will be calculated for you." Ma Jing saw that he was so confident. She quickly said, "I know. Boss, you have worked hard." Dean waved his hand and sent her away. He left the office building and continued to buy materials. A few days later, everything was ready. Dean called Ma Jing and the other 2 in his office. He handed over the written formula and the production project to them. "This is the formula. Follow the process. The new drug is still in the trial stage. Remember to keep it confidential." The 3 nodded. Ma Jing said, "Boss, rest assured. We have signed a confidentiality agreement. We will never leak the formula." Dean nodded slightly. He was more assured about this point, so he didn't say any harsh words. Sometimes the law was more useful than harsh word. Rejuvenation drug? Ma Jing was surprised to see the name of the formula. She asked Dean, "Boss, is this a drug for cell proliferation?" "Almost," Dean casually said. "The effect of the finished product is probably to regenerate broken limbs. You can use mice to test it. Try to make it in a week." The 3 of them widened their eyes and looked at Dean incredulously. "Limb regeneration? The effect is so strong." Soon, the 3 of them thought of another thing. They couldn't help but sink. Dean said that the effect was so good. Didn't it mean that they had to produce such a drug? Dean would blame them for incompetence in case the formula was not good. The 3 of them felt a bit heavy in their hearts. They felt that the salary of the company was higher than that of the general industry. Dean also got up and left the company after the 3 of them left. The formula of the rejuvenation drug came from the alchemists in Sylvia. This kind of drug wasn't rare in Sylvia, but it was hard to find in the market in the Federation. Although the technology of the Federation was prosperous, but most of it was used externally, such as mecha, hot weapons, and so on. This was probably also due to the influence of the external environment. The Federation was constantly facing the threat of monsters and demons. These were all terrifying existences that far surpassed ordinary people. They urgently needed a strong power to protect themselves. Regenerative medicine could be regarded as a war miracle medicine in the old era. However, in this kind of battle where all humans were cannon fodder, things like mecha and firearms were the only useful things. Otherwise, it would be useless even if people could regenerate and become immortal. After all, the difference in strength was too great. If they could not defeat the enemy, everything else would be nonsense. In a place like Sylvia, the Empire deliberately curbed the development of science and technology. There were no hot weapons, so they could only rely on mutation. The focus of the 2 was opposite. One was biased towards the development of mecha, while the other was good at studying the mysteries of the human body and enhancing the strength of the human body. However, there was a market for rejuvenation drugs in the Federation. It was due to the external environment that the four consortiums were more inclined to study things with great destructive power. As the saying goes, when the sky falls down, it will hit the tall ones. The four consortiums were undoubtedly the top in the Federation. When the small companies were racking their brains to figure out how to make money from women and children, they had to think about how to deal with the monsters and demons. How to find the absolute power to rule the Federation. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.